My granddad's been going through a lot lately. After Grandma died, he kinda went a little mushy. We were asked to come and get him one night after he was found wandering near his house, the police suggesting that we might want to have someone keep an eye on him. Since I was just sitting around the house and doing nothing with my life, my parents extended the idea that this might give me a little freedom since I had recently been chafing under my father's rules. They gave me rules, of course, like no using my grandfather's house for wild parties, no sneaking girls in at all hours of the night, and my grandfather's safety would come first. If we get another call about him wandering off, he will be moving to the nursing home, and you will be moving back home. So, I moved my things in with Grandpa, and we became roommates. Grandpa was a pretty good roommate, all things considered. I lived upstairs in the loft. Grandpa had a loft-style house with a whole other dwelling upstairs. And he lived downstairs since it was hard for him to get up and down the stairs sometimes. I did most of the cooking and cleaning. Grandpa bought the groceries and the beer, though that was our little secret, and we lived in harmony most days. The only thing that kind of annoyed me were the stories. Don't get me wrong, Grandpa has a lot of good stories. He's been in the Gulf War, he'd driven trucks in Alaska on treacherous roads, he'd spent almost all his life in the Appalachian Mountains. In fact, this house had been his childhood home. He had many stories about camping and exploring and roaming the woods around the property, those I didn't mind hearing so much. There were many nights that Granddad and I would sit on the porch with a case of beer, and he would tell me stories about exploring the woods and discovering its majesty. It was the lies he would tell sometimes that really got to me. He made up some pretty outlandish claims about the woods that I just couldn't shake off. He would claim to have met a Sasquatch, running for his life as it chased him from the part of the woods it lived in. He had met forest spirits and spent a month in their camp as time moved differently there. He had met animal people, spoken with pale, moonlight guardians that lived underground, and many other things. It wasn't just drunken tales either. Those I could have forgiven, but he would ambush me sometimes with these strange little stories. You'd be washing dishes or cleaning the living room or brushing your teeth, and suddenly he'd just be behind you with a tall tale. I mostly rolled my eyes at these stories, but last night he told me something just truly ridiculous. My best friend Wren turned into a tree. I had choked a little on my beer and finally set it down. I was a little drunk, and maybe I shouldn't have let it frustrate me, but these stories were becoming a bit much. I'd heard all manner of stories from Grandpa and just sort of shrugged them off or politely listened to them, but this one was so bizarre that it took me by surprise. His friend had turned into a tree? What the hell did that mean? Your friend turned into a tree, I challenged. Grandpa nodded and took a swig of his own beer. How, Grandpa? Tell me how a person turns into a tree. He looked thoughtful. It's kind of a long story. Are you sure you have time for it? I was off the next couple of days, so I guessed I did. Yeah, I would say I have time for it. Grandpa finished his beer and threw the bottle into the woods, and I heard it break against a nearby tree. This was a habit he had kept from my childhood, and no one seemed to be able to break him of it. The funny thing was that despite him smashing the bottles, I never found any glass in the woods around his house. I always assumed that Grandma had cleaned it up, but it had continued after Grandma was gone. Just one of life's little mysteries, I told myself. And so, Grandpa began his odd tale. When I was about 9, a new boy moved into the valley. His name was Renoir, but I always just called him Ren. His family was from the Bayou, Louisiana, and he was unsure how things worked out in the Appalachians. Still, I was glad for a new playmate since our closest neighbor was 5 miles in either direction, and we played in the hills and forests around our home. Ren liked to find bugs and small spiders and put them in jars so he could study them. Ren fancied himself something of a scientist, and the Appalachian forests offered him much to explore. Now, the woods were always open to me. Mama never told us we couldn't explore, but Grandma had warned me never to go into the southern grove without her. It was beautiful there, The forest's old and different somehow from the rest of the sprawling valley. I would ask her why I couldn't explore there alone, and she would say that it was dangerous if you didn't know what not to touch and what to leave well enough alone. Like this, she'd say, pointing to a thick, almost honey-like sap that was oozing from a nearby tree. This is the sap of the old calabash tree. You never ever touch it, for if you do, not even I can help you. I asked her why, and she said that her grandma had told her the same many years ago, and she was now telling it to me. It's just one of those rules that we follow. One of those rules we don't question. I had always listened, but Ren was inquisitive. He wanted to explore everything, and he noticed that we were avoiding that particular stretch of forest. I had told him those stories about the places that we weren't allowed to go when we first met. I told him there were two-headed beetles that lived there. There were strange flowers in technicolor patterns, and the large trees that my grandma had always called calabash. He asked me to take him there, not really feeling comfortable exploring the woods alone yet. He was never far from my side when we were in the woods, and he asked me specifically one afternoon if we could go out there. We were young, 10 at the most, and it didn't take much to convince me. I had tried to remain steadfast, not wanting anything to happen since I never went there without Grandma. But he finally broke me down, and I agreed to take him. But I said that he had to do what I say. Don't touch nothing, I told him, especially if I say so. He promised that he wouldn't, and we set off for the grove. We stopped at his house before we went, and he came back with a backpack that clinked a little as he walked. I had little doubt that it was full of specimen jars and other such things. He may not have intended to touch, but he definitely intended to study. So we made our way to the grove, and as soon as he saw that oddly colored place, he was in love. The grove is a special place, you see. Things there are closer to nature than anywhere else, and Grandma always said it was easy to feel the old world magic that connected the people to the earth, and the people who spend a lot of time there can sometimes hear the voice of the forest that others have forgotten. When Grandma read Robert Frost, she thought that maybe he had found some sort of grove of his own. We spent an hour just exploring the grove. Ren looked at the beetles, putting one into a jar so he could study it later, and sketched some of the plants that he made notes on. I showed him the calabash tree, that massive white gold giant, and I saw the wonder in his eyes that was there every time he found a bug or a leaf he didn't recognize. He approached it, and I understood his need to touch it. I myself had needed to touch it the first time to make really sure I understood what I was seeing. It's the size of it, I think. Your mind tells you that nothing that big can possibly be real, but once you touch it, you just know that it must exist. It wasn't until I saw him take his knife out that I realized what his true intentions were. I ran forward, telling him not to, but he seemed mesmerized by that golden bark of that towering tree. He wanted some. That much was obvious, but Grandma had always made it very clear that you do not strip the bark from the calabash tree. Ren didn't know. He probably assumed that a tree so large would have plenty of bark. He couldn't have known what lay beneath. As his knife slid easily into the soft bark of the calabash tree, a golden spurt of sap struck him full in the face. He stumbled back, the sap flowing as his knife quivered in the side of that massive trunk, and I saw him clutch his face and scream. I pulled him away from the tree. The roots threatened to trip him, and as his hands came down, I could see that his face was changing. His face was turning brown, his skin thickening, and the pigment of his eyes was beginning to film over as though he was blind. "What's happening?" Wren asked, his voice deepening as his throat stiffened. I didn't know, but I knew what I had to do. I left his bag on the ground, the jars slamming together angrily, and pulled him onto my shoulders. We were both 3 miles out into the woods, but Wren wasn't very heavy. He was small, even for a boy of 10, and I pulled him onto my back and carried him with very little effort. We ran, heading for my grandmother's house. Grandma would know what to do. She would fix him. As I ran, I just knew that if I could get him there, she could save him. We hadn't gone far when he started getting heavy. Like I said, he wasn't large, but I was only 10, and Wren was starting to get really heavy. The boy was light when we left the grove, me walking as I bounced him on my back, but he became heavier and heavier as we walked. His arms hung uselessly at my sides, and his body became like a stone in the center of my back. His legs started to shake as my progress was slowed to a crawl. When I was drawing up short, I thought maybe one of his feet caught on something. I looked back and almost dropped him. His feet had elongated until they dug up behind me, his toes becoming long and searching. They were pushing their way down into the ground, and as I pulled, they attempted to root themselves in the dirt. I pulled him along, trying my best to get him to my grandmother's, but eventually, I just couldn't take him any further. We were in a clearing, a stream trickling through that I knew would be a heavy little crossing with the winter flow, and I left him there, saying I would go get help. Wren called me back, though, and asked me to stay with him. I told him that I couldn't do that. If I gave up, he'd be stuck like this. My grandma knew about these sorts of things, and she might be able to help him. I made all kinds of excuses, but in the end, I was just scared. This was so weird, so odd, and my 10-year-old brain didn't know what to do about it. He said, "Please," and asked me to stay, his voice cracking like a branch in a high wind. And after some hesitation, I sat and said that I would. His arms and legs were stiff and bark-like, and he cried tears of yellow sap. I wanted to reach out and wipe them away, but I remembered what that sap had done to him and resisted. His feet were growing, breaking the ground and sliding into the earth as they sought purchase. I asked him how he was feeling, and he said it was very strange. He said that as he grew, everything seemed to slow down, to lighten, and he was filled with an odd sense of eternity. He said he felt ancient and brand new. He felt lonely, yet filled with the knowledge that he was never alone. He felt sad for the life he was leaving behind, but excited for the life that was beginning. The process took about 20 minutes from start to finish, and I sat with him as he changed, not wanting him to go through it alone. His skin thickened, taking on a wooden cast as his legs descended into the earth. His chest expanded, Wren groaning as his bones and his body grew, and his small arms were thrust upward as he reached for the sky. His face and body sort of grew into one, becoming his trunk, and his eyes began to sink into his newly formed trunk body. Much too soon, he was a tree, and I was left sitting beside a half-grown sapling with a pair of expressive rings in its trunk. I was left looking into those way too expressive eyes as he sat looking out onto the forest, never to move again. I sat there, mouth agape, as Grandpa finished his story. What happened after that? Surely no one believed that he had turned into a tree. Grandpa shook his head. Only one person. My My family and his spent the night searching the woods with a search party from the town. They thought that something had happened to him, and my brain had made up something to cope with it. They could see I was shaken by whatever had happened, and they still wanted to find Wren to make sure he was okay. I tried to tell them, tried to explain what had happened, but my grandma appeared at that moment and wrapped an arm around me. She told them she would watch me while the town searched and took me into her house for a cocoa. Over cocoa and cookies, she told me that she had tried to warn me about the grove. She said it was a tragedy what had happened, but that was the way of the world sometimes. He took a last pull off his beer and launched it into the woods. She said that life was cruel sometimes, but that there was an order. Wren had tried to go outside that order. He had broke the rules, and that cruelty took its revenge. She reminded me that I must never go against that order, not if I wanted to live amongst nature. I thought about this before shaking my head and telling him I didn't believe it. People don't just turn into trees, Grandpa. He gave me a strange look and just walked into the house. I thought that was the end of the story, but that would be too easy for Grandpa. He woke me up the next morning, about 3 hours before I wanted to be up, and asked if I wanted to meet Wren. It took my fuzzy brain a few minutes to realize what he was talking about before I remembered the story and asked if he meant the tree. Yes, would you like to meet him? I sighed. I didn't have anything going on that day, so I agreed. We walked into the woods, Grandpa ambling along, and hiked for about an hour into the crisp morning air. For a man in his 70s, Grandpa moved with an odd grace through the familiar woods of his childhood. I suppose he always had, but it was more pronounced now that he was so old. The squirrels and birds were just starting to get noisy, and I could hear the sounds of the forest as we walked. The wind in the trees, the soft noises of small animals in the brush as they avoided the louder sounds of people, the sigh of the leaves as they pushed and pulled towards their inevitable death. Having come here often with my grandparents, I too had become aware of the sounds and tempers of the Appalachian forest. My cousins and I had often found it beautiful and mysterious, but it could be fickle and temperamental too. Just ask my cousin Jeremy, who had twisted his ankle in a hole, only to find that hole was the home of a rattlesnake. If you could ask him, since he'd died while we were getting help. Grandpa led us to a clearing, a small stream bubbling beside it with fresh snow run, and I could see a large, golden-barked tree growing not far from the river. It was towering, probably 15 feet tall, and as I approached, Grandpa shot a hand out and pointed down. I had nearly stepped into a small stream of honey-colored sap that was trickling away from the tree and making its way towards the river. "Don't want 2 calabashes growing so close together," Grandpa chuckled. He greeted the tree as we approached, and came around to its front to touch its trunk. The tree didn't move, didn't speak, but as I came up, I could see a swirl pattern on the front that looked like 2 huge eyes. The eyes seemed to follow you whenever you moved, which was a little unsettling. Though unsettling, the tree looked no different from any other, except for the color and the weird sap. It wasn't until the wind picked up through the branches, shaking the leaves and making them dance, that I thought I heard a creaky old voice say, "Hello, Howard," in response to my grandfather's greeting. We spent some time there, just talking that day. It seems I have a lot to learn from Grandpa's old stories. Maybe I'll tell you some more sometime, if Grandpa's feeling talkative. Grandpa and I were out on the back porch, spending our evenings as we often did, when I asked him about a weird story my parents had used to scare me as a kid. It was some kind of monster cat that would eat me if I was bad. I said, swirling my beer around thoughtfully as I tried to remember what it was called. I used to live in fear of this thing, since Mom said it would come get me if I didn't do my chores. It was, the whooping cat? The whomping cat? "The Wampus cat?" my grandpa said, draining his beer and launching it into the tree line like he often did. "Yeah, that was the one. I hadn't thought about him until last night in a long time. I dreamed that I was small again, wandering around your house and looking for people. I never really saw him, but out of the corner of my eye, I could see this big shadowy creature stalking me. He kind of reminded me of one of those guys in a mascot costume. I never really got a good look at him. It was always hiding, but I remember being pretty scared as it followed me around the house. He made this kind of sound like a house cat, but loud and long, like a cat that's been startled or is about to fight. Suddenly, Grandpa loosed a cry like a scalded cat, and I heard all the animal noises around us taper off. He looked back at me and asked, "Did it sound like that?" I was speechless. "Yeah, exactly like that. But how?" "I taught your mother how to recognize that call. I didn't want her to go through the same horrific experience I had." I was slightly confused. Experience like what, exactly? "The Wampus cat." I stared at him for a moment, the night bird starting to tune up again, as Grandpa leaned back and stared at the night sky. We were silent for a few minutes, the crickets loud as they put on their last concert before autumn put them to ground. Then, Grandpa suddenly said, "I saw him once, you know." My head was a little foggy, and I just mumbled out, "Saw who?" "The Wampus cat. I saw him once." My skepticism started to claw its way out again, but ever since the tree incident, I had been a little more open to Grandpa's stories. "Yeah? You want to tell me about it?" Grandpa seemed to think about it for a minute before he began. "I was about 5 or 6 when your cousin Luke came to stay for a week. My mother's sister was going to stay with Luke's sister, her first daughter, to help her deliver her baby, and she asked if Luke could stay for a while. Mama said that he'd be staying in my room with me, and even though I said I didn't mind, I wasn't very excited by the prospect of Luke staying with us. Luke was not a good kid, you see. Luke was the baby in his family, 2 older brothers and a sister who were all out of the house, and this had led to him being a bit of a brat. He was also a bully, and I knew I would have to keep an eye on my things if I didn't want them to go missing, that was. I would also have to make sure to spend as much time in the woods as I could when I wasn't in school. Otherwise, Luke would likely make up excuses to play rough with me. I wasn't a fragile child, but Luke was a few years older than me, and I had often seen bruises after we played. So Luke came over, bag packed for a week or more, and Aunt Kara thanked us for letting him stay. Despite her difficult son, Aunt Kara was an absolute delight, and I didn't hold it against her that I would have to deal with Luke for the foreseeable future. She gave me a tight hug, thanking me for taking Luke into my room and promising me something special when she came back. I thanked her, but I was thinking that the only gift I was looking forward to was the return of my room and my quiet existence. I showed Luke to our room, showing him the cot he would be sleeping on. I turned to find him putting his bag at the foot of my bed. When I asked him what he was doing, he just grinned like a fox and waggled his finger at me. "Not very Christian of you to make a guest sleep on that saggy old cot. A real guest would have been offered the bed while you sleep on the cot, don't you think?" I wanted to argue with him, but I realized it wouldn't do any good. As I tried to get comfortable on that cot that night, listening to Luke snore lustily in my bed, I knew it was going to be a long few weeks. After a week of having Luke there, though, I was good and ready for him to be gone. In that time, he had managed to sprain my wrist after he pushed me out of a tree, stole my favorite rock from my collection, though he claimed he hadn't done it, and break any number of the small number of toys I owned. To my parents, he was an angel, always minding his manners around my mother and especially around my strict father. He always appeared to help with chores, walked with me to school, and was polite while they were around. The second their backs were turned, though, he cut school and shirked his chores and mocked their bumpkin ways to their backs. Then, one Sunday, it all came to a head. It was working towards mid-afternoon. the sun taking on that golden tint that you see when it's getting ready to set, when a knock came at the door, hard and frantic. Daddy went to get it, and it turned out to be Mrs. Douglas, our second closest neighbor. She had ran nearly 6 miles to our house to get our help. You see, she needed to get Mr. Douglas to the hospital. He had fallen off a ladder while fixing something and broke his leg pretty badly. She had managed to get him onto the porch, but she couldn't drive him there herself since they didn't own a car. This was the mid-1930s, so that wasn't uncommon, and my parents agreed to help her. Mama told us to stay here while she went to help Daddy, telling us to tidy up while she was gone. I asked Mama if I could go with them, saying I wanted to help, but really just not wanting to be left alone with Luke. Mama smiled and ruffled my hair, thinking I was just trying to avoid my chores, and told me that I had to stay here and watch over the house while they were gone. Besides, you don't want the Wampus cat to hear you're shirking your responsibilities, do you? That had sent a chill up my spine. Much like you, I was pretty scared of that Wampus cat. Not just because my mama talked about it, but because my grandmama talked about it. Grandma used to say that the Wampus cat came to get little kids who disobeyed their parents, dragging them off into the woods to devour them in its lair. She said he roamed the woods, listening for misbehaving children, and took care of them so their parents no longer had to be burdened with them. He has coal black fur and glowing embers for eyes. He's as tall as a man and as wide as a bear. He has razor-sharp teeth that seem too big for his mouth and claws like kitchen knives. You'll know him by his cry, a sound like a cat scalded by the stove and by the smell of fresh blood. Nothing will stop him from getting his prey. Nothing. And you don't want to be the focus of his ire. When Grandma told me to beware of something, I bewared it. So, as the old truck rumbled out of the front yard, I set about my chores. There were dishes to be washed, there were floors to sweep, and there were counters to clean, and there was washing to bring in as well. As I started wiping the counter, I heard Luke snort, continuing to throw the baseball he had been playing with into the air before catching it. He hadn't gotten up from the couch, and he was sitting with his head near the ground and his feet on the back, something Mama had asked him not to do. You don't still believe in that old cat, do you? I looked up, confused by the question. Of course, Mama wouldn't lie about something like that. Don't you? No. I figured out a while ago that the Wampus cat was made up. Have you ever seen a cat that big? It's all just nonsense. I tried to rationalize this, the cleaning cloth still held in my hand. That couldn't be right. My mama would never lie to me, and my grandma would certainly never lie to me. My mama might tease me sometimes, but she always told me it was a joke afterward. My grandma, though, did not joke about the strange things that might be found in the Appalachians. This would muddy the water and might cause me to question something that might very well get me killed. As Luke played with his ball, I continued to clean and finish my chores. As I cleaned, I began to feel something watching me. It began as a tickle on the back of my neck, that feeling that I wasn't quite alone. As I washed the dishes, I could almost feel a presence looming just out of sight, its hulking form seen out of the corner of my eye. It seemed to linger near the windows, its bulk sometimes blocking out the light. I felt my eyes creeping over to have a look, but I remembered what my grandma had always said and kept my eyes forward and away from the windows. If you ever feel something watching you, it's best to just ignore it. Some critters really don't like being seen, and seeing them could be the last thing you ever do. I finished the dishes as the sun began to sink towards the edge of the horizon. I could feel those eyes behind me, could feel them boring into me,
and I didn't want to look at whatever possessed those eyes. It seemed intent on me, showing no attention to my cousin in the living room. I had to finish cleaning. Mama would be mad if I didn't. I turned around, my legs like wooden pegs beneath me, and felt my stomach sink into my throat as I saw him. I only saw him for a second, but that was a second too long. He loomed in the window near the mudroom, his bulk making the setting sun appear muted. His fur was coal black, looking matted and tangled as the burdock stood out against the glass. His eyes were living coals, seeming to simmer in his head as he stared at me. His claws tapped lightly against the window, those long yellow talons that sprouted from his furry hands. His teeth were too big for his mouth, and they poked out haphazardly from a heaving maw that fogged the glass with every breath. He moved away after a few seconds, pushing his bulk out of the window sill, but it had been long enough to etch his image in my memory. I felt the hardwood of the cabinet as it ground against my back. I sat down hard on my backside, my eyes glued to the window as they bulged in fear. The window was empty now, but I could still see the remains of his final, gasping breath. I could still see his face if I closed my eyes, and those claws would haunt my dreams for many nights to come. I was shaking as I watched the window, seeing his shadow as it slid across the porch, his weight making the boards groan and the slats creak. "What are you doing?" I looked over, seeing Luke standing there with a questioning look spread across his face. I pointed shakily towards the door, my voice refusing to come out. "Oh, what? Is it the great Wampus cat waiting for me?" I nodded furiously, pointing at the window. Luke moved to the window, looking out onto the porch and snorting at me. He said he didn't see anything out there, and moved to the door to open it. I cried out, not making any intelligible sound, not wanting him to let it in. I sounded like a dog strangling on a bit of something, unable to draw in breath. He unlocked the door and turned the handle, pulling the door as if in slow motion. I screamed internally as that door swung open, my throat holding it in till I felt like I might burst. He stepped out onto the porch, looking around the door before turning back to grin at me. "Well, either he's great at hiding or he ain't here. Almost like he's made up. I told you there was no Wampus cat, nothing to punish naughty kids. Your mama lied, just like mine, and there's nothing that can do anything about—" A shadow fell across him. My attention had been drawn away as he spoke, but it snapped back to the large black silhouette behind him as the doorway was engulfed. Luke still stood grinning in victory, but his smile dribbled off his face as he took notice of the shadow that fell across the floor. He turned his head ever so slightly, but I don't think he ever saw the Wampus cat. The creature wrapped its thick furry arms around him, lifting him easily into that gaping maw of razor-sharp piano keys. Luke screamed as his head slid into that toothy mouth, and he went on screaming until the Wampus cat crunched down and ended his life. He stared at me as he stood there, Luke's body hanging in his arms, before he turned and took his grisly supper back into the sea of green.
I sat there, speechless, as my grandpa finished his story. The night sounds were all around us again, the birds and the bugs tuning up, as Grandpa took a sip from his nearly forgotten beer. His throat had been getting rough towards the end, and the beer seemed to wet it like a dry valley in a rainstorm. He finished the beer in one pull and launched the bottle into the woods, where it shattered against a tree. "So, what happened when they got home? Surely they didn't believe that a big
cat monster came and ate your cousin." He stared into the dark, his face that of a child who's been scared into silence. He was quiet for so long that I thought he had fallen asleep, and I snapped my fingers in front of his face a few times to see if he was dozing. He snapped awake after a few seconds of this, blinking and looking around as the fear slid away. Even so, it was several minutes before he spoke. "Well, as it usually happened, Grandma came to save me. Not from the Wampus cat, of course. He only took naughty children. She came to save me from my terror. She came and found me shaking like a leaf, the door still open, and the sun sinking low in the sky. She took me to her house and wrapped me in a quilt. I sat there for hours, my mind throbbing under the weight of all that fear. It isn't every day you see the focus of your fears made flesh, and I spent a few days at my grandma's house as my mind tried to make sense of all of it. My mother came in a panic after finding Luke and me missing, and when Grandma told her what had happened, she tried to push her way to me immediately. Grandma held her back, though, telling her to be patient with me. He's been through a lot, Possum. Give him time and let him rest. He's seen the Wampus cat and lived to tell the tale. Not many can say that. I sat in that shaking stupor for quite some time before I was able to gain control of myself again. Aunt Kara came to see Grandma too, and I heard her crying. She cried, she wailed as I shivered beneath my blanket, but she never told anyone what had happened to her son. I heard she told everyone that he drowned in a lake while swimming, and no one asked any questions because that's just the way things were out here sometimes. I never saw her again. She seemed to have lost her taste for the Appalachians. I went back home, and I learned to live with the knowledge that there were things out there that could kill me, things that played by their own rules. This was my first taste of strangeness, and I never forgot it. Somewhere in the woods, a cat yowled, and I shuddered to my core. I knew it was nothing but a mountain bobcat, but it was still a little too close to the cry my mother had always made for my taste. I got up then, taking my own bottle to the garbage as I went back inside. Grandpa asked me where I was going before I could walk in, and it took me a few seconds before I could answer him. I forgot to take out the garbage earlier. I don't want any damn cat to think I'm shirking my house chores. My grandpa's laughter followed me into the house.
It's Christmas time in the Appalachians, and the holidays are as big a deal here as they are anywhere. That being said, Grandpa's been keeping me pretty busy lately. On December 1st, as I lay sleeping off the leftovers of Thanksgiving turkey, which we'd been eating all week, Grandpa shook me awake and said it was time we got started. I tried to roll over, tried to tell him to let me sleep a bit longer. He just shook me again and told me to get up and help him get the things from the attic. When I asked what things we were getting, he looked shocked. "Why, Christmas decorations. We have to make sure everything's ready for the season." Grandpa has always been a nut for Christmas time. I can remember visiting my grandparents during the holidays, smelling the aromas of the season as I walked through the door. Gingerbread, sugar cookies, Grandma's traditional fruitcake, which she usually gave as gifts and tasted better than anything from the store, and the cinnamon miasma of homemade cider. Grandma baked from November 22nd to January 5th, and our house always seemed to contain a pie or a cookie or some other confection she had whipped up for the season. And while Grandma baked, Grandpa decorated. As we set it all up, I realized the Herculean effort Grandpa must have gone into every year to make the house look as festive as possible. Garland was stretched on every eve, mistletoe hung in bushels, lights twinkled merrily, and the sounds of Christmas decorations, as well as the wooden decorations that Grandpa carved, were everywhere. Some of you have asked on that note what Grandpa does with himself to keep busy, and I'm here to tell you that he's one of the best woodworkers in the valley. He makes furniture, walking sticks, many other pieces that he usually sells at the flea market, usually around this time of year actually. Even the most jaded child's eyes would often light up at the sight of a deer or a wolf that Grandpa had cozied out of a block of pine or spruce or maple, and many of the intricate decor pieces looked very homey against the singing horde of Walmart abominations. After a week of setting up plastic deer, hanging Christmas lights, and nailing garland around the house, I felt tired and a little scroogey. I had already figured in my head that, come the 1st of January, I was going to have to take all this crap down and help him stow it again. Grandpa had thrown up half a Walmart holiday section and a quarter of the local hardware store's Holly Jolly aisle. I just knew that it would take a week to get this all back in the attic, and the thought was making me testy already. I was hanging stockings from the fireplace when I heard a sudden chirp of a cricket. I jumped a little, not expecting to hear the sudden invasion of the insect. I hadn't heard a cricket since the cold front a few weeks ago. He was a big fella, too. His body was coal black, and his legs were long and sinuous. He sounded off again, hopping a little closer to the crackling fire, and I reached slowly for the magazine sitting on the end table. This guy had clearly been hiding amongst the decorations, and I didn't want to have to deal with him until spring. When my hand met resistance, I looked back to see that Grandpa had caught the end of my magazine.
"Don't do it, boy. It could be the worst mistake of your life."
I gave him a strange look, but relaxed my arm nonetheless. "Sounds like maybe you have some experience with this sort of thing," I said, moving over to help Grandpa with the tree as he prepared to spin another of his yarns. Grandpa put a hand down for the cricket, and it seemed to come to him as though it knew him.
"It was the worst month of my life, that's for sure," he began,
putting the cricket on his shoulder as he began his story with his usual flair.
"'Twas the night after Thanksgiving, and all through our home, no one was sleeping. A cricket did roam. The cricket had been waking us up every night for 2 weeks. No one knew where he'd come from. Snow would come early to the mountain that year, and there was never a time when there wasn't at least a few inches on the ground after Halloween. A blizzard was coming, and the old-timers were predicting feet of snow for Christmas. 2 of my cousins, John and Matthew, were staying with us for the foreseeable future. Their parents were up north and snowbound by a sudden blizzard. They had sent a letter with some money and asked us to look after them until they could get back. We were happy to oblige. Unlike Luke, they were good company. All of us were around the same age, 10 or close enough, and we spent our days in the yard building snowmen, having snowball fights, and sledding. It could have been one of the best Christmases of my life, were it not for the cricket and what it brought with it. The cricket was still alive for 2 very good reasons. The first was that, as everyone in the Appalachians knows, a cricket on your hearth, especially at Christmas time, is good luck. My grandma said so, and my mother and father, not typically superstitious, also said so. Despite its chirping keeping us awake, my parents refused to kill it. They always held firm to the idea that the cricket would bring good luck, but I suspect there was another side of that coin that they weren't telling us. The other reason was just as simple. We couldn't find him. We suspected that he was in the chimney, but he didn't seem too bothered by the heat from our fireplace. My parents assumed he was in a crevice in the stonework, and that's why his chirping was so loud. His chirping would come vibrating down the chimney stack and quaver across the house so all could suffer his noise. Then, one day, I suppose I had finally had enough. It was late, the middle of the night, and the cricket had been sounding off every hour. A single loud chirp that would scrape across my consciousness like a razor and bring me shuddering awake. After 7 or 8 days of this, I was getting rattled, and the lack of real sleep was starting to make us all a little cranky. No matter how many pillows you put over your head, or how hard you stuff the cotton in your ears, or whatever you decided to do to block out the noise, the sound would shiver into your eardrums and bring you awake with jarring clarity. I had gotten up to get a drink of water when I finally saw the little bastard. I was walking to the kitchen when I heard him chirp. I turned to look at the crackling fire, and I saw his tiny form dancing in the backdrop. He was just sitting there, warming himself and chirping happily. I reached towards the counter as my hand closed around the fly swatter, knowing I was about to end his reign of terror. I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering that I shouldn't do it, but my sleep-deprived mind only wanted one thing. I wanted peace. I wanted quiet. And above all else, I wanted to sleep. The cricket looked up at me as though to ask if it could help me. His body crunched as I brought the swatter down on him, and for a moment, I basked in the sudden quiet as I headed back to bed. But that silence wouldn't last long. No sooner had I climbed back into bed, snuggling down and getting ready to sleep, than I heard it again, the merry chirp of a cricket. My eyes popped open. I looked around my room for the source of the noise. The room was empty, filled with the shadows cast by the moon as it played amongst my toys and clothes and other objects hanging around. The chirp had sounded close, though, like it was in the room with me. It had been annoying before, but now it was so loud I could barely stand it. I was getting ready to hunker down, thinking I was imagining things, when a small black shape jumped closer to the bed. It was framed in the moonlight, its antenna wiggling intently, and its shape was impossible to mistake. I covered my head with my pillow, burrowing under the quilts and blankets I had piled on my bed to keep warm. They did little to stop my shivering as I lay hunkered beneath them, unsure of what to do next. Was it following me? Was it a ghost? I had left the cricket as a smear on the stone in the living room. I didn't know what to make of this new cricket, but its presence definitely spooked me. When it sounded off beneath the covers, I jumped, scuttling backwards as I tried to get some distance between it and me. I could feel something on my face, its pinchy feet scuttling over my lips and cheek, and I slapped my hand to my face trying to swipe it away. It seemed to be one step ahead of my searching hands, though, and when I felt the legs touch my ear, I slapped at the side of my head hard enough to make my ears ring. Despite my ringing ears, though, I still felt the cricket slide into my head, and my horror made me shudder in silence. I felt the tears leak down my face as the sharp tweet of the cricket came from right inside my ear, sounding huge and deafening. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I was too busy hearing the cricket as he chirped inside my noggin. I woke up groggy and scared, unsure if I had been dreaming or if any of it had actually happened. I stuck my finger in my ear and rooted, not feeling anything. The chirping was gone, and by the light of day, I could believe that it was all just a dream. I could hear people talking quietly in the living room, and I rolled out of bed, ready to start another day of fun. My cousins were up already when I staggered into the living room. They were sipping mugs of heavily doctored coffee and looking at the snow as it came down. As I stood watching the fresh powder fall, I winced when a sudden loud chirp blistered my eardrums. I was on the verge of hyperventilating, having come to terms with the fact that it had indeed been real. My eyes felt like they might bug out of my head, and I staggered back a step as I clutched my ear. "What's wrong with you?" John asked, looking at me strangely. Cricket, I gasped, putting a finger in my ear and shaking it. I felt nothing. Nothing came out, but I knew what I had heard. "I know, isn't it great?" Matthew said. "First good night's sleep I've had all week. I didn't hear that little bugger all night. Me either, John agreed, and they clinked their mugs together in celebration. I was glad they had slept well, but it appeared my troubles were just beginning. The snow came down, piling high enough to cover Daddy's truck, and Mama was afraid that we would be snowbound soon. We had a lot of supplies laid in, but with 5 of us living here 24 hours a day, the supplies were likely to only last a few weeks. We were just kids, though, and while my parents worried about supplies, we played in the snow. I had hoped that the cold might deter the cricket, maybe even draw him out, but I never felt him stir all day. What I did feel was his ear-piercing chirps at random times throughout the day. When I came inside later, I had developed a slight twitch from the sudden and unpredictable chirping of the cricket. As the days persisted, my mother became concerned at the jumpy, twitchy way I was starting to act. The chirps were like an ice pick in my head, and I knew that I wouldn't sleep a wink that night for the noise. As I lay awake, hearing the pair of crickets chirping at odd intervals in my skull, I remember the crickets chirp from the living room as a happy memory. The week that followed was a bit of a blur. I lived in a state of constant pain. I don't think I slept more than a few minutes a night. Sometimes the thing would chirp ceaselessly, making my head ring like the inside of a bell. Sometimes he would lure me into a false sense of security, though, by not chirping for hours, only to chirp loudly just as I would drift off to sleep. Sometimes it would sound like one cricket. Sometimes it would sound like a whole swarm of crickets had hopped in and started chirping around inside my head. By the end of that week, I was ready for the funny farm, and I worried that my life would never be the same again. Luckily for me, Grandma came through again. After 7 straight days, the snow was halfway up the window. It had been falling steadily, and a real blizzard was brewing outside. We had all been kept inside as Daddy tried to keep the front door clear, and my cousins were reading or playing with toys as I slowly went mad. I was sitting in the corner, the twitching becoming worse by the day, and everyone had started avoiding me. I was deteriorating mentally since the cricket had gotten into my ear, becoming a prisoner in my own body. I shook. I made strange noises. I pissed my pants sometimes. I seemed to cry ceaselessly. I had seen a kid at school once that had fits, and he had sat in the back and twitched just this way. I remembered being scared that I would be like this forever, and I remembered praying to God to help get this cricket out of my head. As if in response, the door burst open, and my grandma came in with a bundle of firewood under each arm. Grandma had come from her house to ours, and no one was quite sure how she had carried 2 large stacks of firewood through the snow like that. Mama had my cousins take the firewood and set Grandma down by the fire. She didn't immediately see me, but her eyes grew wide and concerned when she did. She didn't say anything then, but she came to my room after my parents and cousins went to bed that night to talk to me. "What have you done, my love?" she asked as I lay in bed. I turned my weeping eyes to hers and stuttered out the whole story. I told her about the cricket, the constant chirping, the erosion of my mental state, and she just nodded. I explained it through the chirping explosions of my head's house guest, and she seemed ready to weep with me every time I twitched. She took it all in, and when I was done, she got up and said she needed some things from her house. "It may take me some time to get the things I need, but I think I can remove this curse from you. Stay strong, love. I'll be back as quickly as I can." For the next 3 days, I neither ate nor slept. Mama fussed over me, trying to get me to eat something. Daddy thought I had just gone stir crazy and told her just to wait and see if I would snap out of it. My cousins were curious, but ultimately grew tired of watching me lie in bed and drool on my quilt. Inside my head, the crickets were the only ones who kept me company. Their chirping grew more erratic as time went on. Mama changed my clothes when I messed myself, but eventually she just left me naked with a towel under me. I don't remember those days very well. I mostly just existed. Mama was getting worried about Grandma, too. She just left out into the snow without a word. What happens if she freezes out there? "Don't you worry, Pook," my daddy said to her. "Mama's been living in these mountains for a long time. She knows how to come and go without much fuss." I hoped, in as much capacity as I could hope, that he was right. Grandma couldn't get lost in the mountains. Could she? I had seen her navigate these hills with ease in any season. The thought that she could get herself lost was laughable at best, but the thought that a cricket could infest my mind had seemed silly too a few weeks ago. Then, sometime in the wee hours of the fourth day, I looked up, and she was there. She picked me up as easy as a rag doll and took me through the dark house. The boards creaked sleepily, and the snow pattered gently on the window. I could hear the sounds of my family as they snored around us, and if they heard us, they never stirred. She took me into the bathroom and locked the door, sitting me into the heavy tub that had been Daddy's wedding present to Mama all those years ago. She poured in water, cold and fresh, as she opened her bag. She also had several buckets of lukewarm water, and I felt my skin break out in goose prickles as I lay there in the semi-warmth. "Hold still now, and don't interrupt," she said, pouring a packet of dried something on me. She sprinkled me with dust, with herbs, with salves, and even something that stung my eyes and made my skin tingle. She chanted as she did it, and I could see the flicker of flames as she spoke in her grandmother's tongue, as she called it. She spoke something long and musical, something deep and winding, and as I felt a wiggle in my ear, I sucked in a ragged breath. It felt like someone was pulling steel wool out of my head, and I gritted my teeth as I waited for it to be over. Suddenly, I heard a loud plop as it fell into the tub. I turned my head to look, but Grandma hissed at me to be still. She likely knew what was coming next, but I was unprepared for the sudden torrent. My ears began to buzz, and my head felt like it might burst. I could hear the ringing of 1,000 different crickets, and I felt them pouring out and filling the tub. Their feet and antennae scraped at my ears. Their shrill cries made me want to scream, and as they fell into the water, I heard them tweet in pain as they drowned. My grandmother lifted me out suddenly, holding me close as the sounds of the dying insects grew louder and louder. When it finally stopped, we cried together, my ears mercifully quiet. I looked at him, the firelight twinkling in his eyes as he came back from that long-ago Christmas time. "So, your grandmother cured you?" I asked. "Well, sort of. I've had a persistent ringing in my ear ever since, but the chirping was indeed gone. A few days later, and I was back to my old self, though I could still swear I heard the phantom cricket sounds for about a week after she took the curse off me." My eyes went a little wide then. "The cricket cursed you?" Grandpa nodded. "It was all my grandmother could figure. The little critter had been killed needlessly, and instead of good luck, it had bestowed a curse instead. Grandma said I had been lucky she had come around. The cricket in my head would have eventually become too much, and I would have probably died or gone too crazy to ever come back from it.
I looked back to the cricket, now showing a bit more respect. What will you do with that fella? Grandpa told me to follow him, and he took me back into his room. In his bathroom, the whole thing wrapped with a towel to keep the cold out, was a small mesh cage that contained about 5 or 6 sluggish crickets. They nibbled on potato slices, drank water from a dish, and hopped around the wood chips on the floor of the cage. Grandpa added his new friend to the cage and smiled at me as he closed the little door.
I'll take them to the woods when it gets warm, the ones that last the winter anyway. I always release them come spring, so they can bring luck to others next winter.
I hugged him then, glad he had saved me from something similar to the fate that he had endured, and he patted my back happily.
Now, come on, he said a few minutes later, listening to the crickets tooting up in their cage. We have to make this place ready for Santa Claus. I met him once. Did I ever tell you about that?
And as we went back to our decorating, he told me about a night in Alaska where he had indeed met the jolly old man himself. From all of us here at Grandpa's cabin, nestled down in the North Georgia mountains, Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. May the cricket on your fireplace bring you luck in the years to come. Grandpa and I were spending another night on the porch, having a beer and listening to the sounds of an early spring. The snow had melted and the critters were just starting to wake up. The forest was alive with the sounds of insects and small animals as they moved about in the light snow that still seemed to hang around sometimes. I had seen a possum the other day, heard him digging through the trash too, so I knew that the snow wouldn't last much longer. As we sat, Grandpa telling me a story about the time a bear cub had crawled into the cab of his truck, I saw another hopeful sign. In the woods, about 10 feet from the house, were fireflies. They were hovering in the air, winking on and off, and Grandpa's story suddenly fell into the background as I sat, unable to take my eyes off them. They were beautiful, the first fireflies of the season, and as Grandpa rolled over me like white noise, I felt myself getting up and going to see them. They weren't too far away. I could get to them in a few seconds, and I got a little mad when Grandpa grabbed my arm, but the second I looked into his eyes, taking them off the lights, I forgot why.
Don't follow them lights, son. Bad things happen if you follow the fairy lights.
Fairy lights? I asked, sitting down, feeling a little woozy.
Yeah, devious little buggers. They're not actually fairies, though. Even they don't really know what they are, but they fear them and avoid them when they can.
Wait, I said, my head a little floaty. Like real fairies?
One story at a time, kiddo. We're talking about the fairy lights. They almost got me once. Did I ever tell you about that?
He threw his bottle into the woods, and to my surprise, the fairy lights stopped blinking. No, but it sounds like you're about to.
Grandpa smiled. Seems that way. This story begins as most bad decisions often do, with drinking. I was about 16 when I had encountered the fairy lights. It wasn't the first time I'd seen them, but it was the first time they had really affected me. I first saw them when I was about 2 or 3, sitting on my grandma's porch. I got up and tried to toddle after them, wanting to catch them and see what they were, when my grandma scooped me up. Boy, was I mad. She said I swung my chubby fists at her until there was a door between us and the lights, and then I was just as mild as paint. She told me a few years later, when I was older, that the lights were bad and that I must never follow them. They lead people into the woods, and most of the people are never seen again. No one knows what they are, but they seem to delight in getting people lost. I always went inside when I saw them after that, not wanting the temptation. Grandma told me, too, that they usually took children, so I was especially wary of them. Grandma had always been honest with me about the things that would hurt me in the forest, and when she told me to beware, I bewared. She helped me a lot, she taught me a lot, and I owe her my life more times over than I can count. This time, though, she wasn't around to save me. They say that luck belongs to children and drunks, and a good thing for me that it does. It was Saturday night, and my friends Dale and Fred and Clarence and I had pulled back into the woods in Dale's old farm truck. We'd been working all day at the mill, chopping trees to load onto trailers, and we were sticky and tired. Dale had hooked a jug of his dad's shine. His dad was a prolific moonshiner in those days, and we were drinking and talking and just relaxing after a long day. There was talk that America might go into the war, World War II that was, and we were all scared that we might get drafted. We were just backwoods hicks. We didn't know nothing about foreign places or distant theaters of combat, but we knew that men died in war and that men came back crippled and changed. The drunker we got, though, the less we started caring about the war and the more we started loosening up. Dale was in the back of the truck, pretending to be our teacher, Mr. Popper, when we saw the lights. Dale had a knack for imitations, and Mr. Popper was an Englishman with a very thick accent. Dale had been strutting about, speaking to us in that way that Mr. Popper had. Mr. Popper always sounded like someone in a Shakespeare play, and went way over the heads of some of us Appalachian stump-thumpers. We had all been laughing and cawing at the way he captured the man so well, and he had just raised his finger to deliver one of those plummy British idioms that Mr. Popper was so fond of, when he stopped and looked out into the woods. He had been silent for about 5 seconds, just staring drunkenly out into the forest, when he finally whispered, "What is that?" We all turned around to see what he was seeing, and that's when we saw the lights too. Growing up in the middle of nowhere, I had never seen a radio tower before. These lights were like the blinking lights on top of those towers. They were foggy and hard to discern, and they would wink on and off as they seemed to float. The longer we watched in our drunken haze, the more enticing those lights began to look. Dale and I had climbed slowly out of the back of the truck and began to walk towards them, and Fred and Clarence were moving like deep-sea divers as they followed. Even drunk out of our mind like I was, I seemed to remember that there was something I should remember about those lights. The more I tried to think about it, though, the more important it seemed. I just couldn't come up with it, though. I decided to follow them into the woods. Maybe then I'd remember. And so, all 4 of us found ourselves tripping through the pitch-black woods by night, stumbling and laughing as we followed those lights. The farther into the woods we went, the more the idea that we shouldn't be here nagged at me. I had a bottle in my hand that I seemed unable to let go of. It was a RC Cola or something, and the other 3 were staggering after those lights, all of us laughing like fools. I remember Clarence tripping over a log and cutting his forehead pretty bad, but he just got up and grinned and laughed as he followed those lights. The lights seemed to be making us drunker, if that makes any sense. We kept stumbling after them, deeper and deeper as they got farther and farther away. I say they got farther, but it was like they never moved. Them lights kept blinking and twinkling in different colors, and they always seemed to be farther away than we remembered them. We kept stumbling after them, and they just kept getting farther away, and in our drunken stupor, we never questioned it. We all just laughed and chuckled, saying how we would catch 'em and find out what was making those lights. I don't know if they ever figured it out, but I still haven't to this day. The deeper into the woods we got, the more it seemed like it was getting foggy. The ground was really hard to find, and as we tripped along, we started to feel like we were in a cloud. I'm sorry if that doesn't make much sense, but you have to remember I was 16 and drunk and under the influence of whatever those lights were. I can only remember this in that muzzy way you remember dreams. I can see the lights, I can see the fog, and the trees around me are just vague outlines in my mind as it goes in slow motion and then in double time. I couldn't tell you how long we wandered through those woods, but I know where that wandering came to an end. We had come to a point where the lights had started to get closer. They were about 7 of them, each of them a different color. I wouldn't be able to have said it at the time, because we really didn't have such things, but they were like the lights on a Christmas tree, only bigger. Oranges and reds and purples and blues and greens, whites, even a black one that shouldn't have been able to be seen, but it was. The fog was thick around our feet, and I couldn't have told you what part of the woods we were in. We could have been halfway to Elijah for all I know, but it hardly mattered, as the lights seemed to be letting us get closer at long last. We came through a stand of trees, and there they were, just floating 15 feet away from us. Each of them was about 4.5 feet tall and seemed to wink in and out of existence as we watched them. I can hear their voices telling us to come on, to come see them, and I saw Dale stumble forward, his hand outstretched to do just that. Then he fell forward, and I never saw him again. It didn't really bother me that Dale had disappeared. In fact, at the time, it seemed funny. I remember Clarence almost doubling over in laughter, thinking that Dale was pulling a trick or something. Clarence and Fred went forward next, hands outstretched like they meant to touch him, and they laughed and slurred their words as they went. They were laughing and joking, saying how they wondered if the lights would be cold or hot. Then they disappeared, and it was just me. I would have gone with Clarence and Fred, but the need to make water had overtaken me. In my drunken state, I hadn't even been able to get my pants down, and as I wet myself, the lights just kept talking to me. They wanted me to come to them. They wanted me to touch them. They wanted me to see what they had for me. I wasn't afraid. Far from it. I wanted to go. I wanted to see them, and I wanted to see where my friends had gone. I knew that the light had made them disappear, and I really wanted to see where they had gone to. If that rock hadn't been in my way, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Mostly 'cause I'd be dead, and you would have never been born. The rock seemed to grab my foot, and I went down hard on my face. As I fell, the bottle I had been holding smashed, and I felt my hand get wet and painful as the glass sank into it. The voice in my head changed then, and I heard the worst screaming of my life. It was like the pits of hell had opened up, and I could hear all the tortured souls within. I looked up, and I could see the lights pulsating real fast, hurting my eyes, hurting my brain, putting my face down in the dirt. I waited for all that screaming to be over. When I came to, it was morning time, and my hand was on fire. The alcohol had worn off, and I was looking around. I could see the lights and the mist from the night before were gone. I was face down on the forest, my pants stiff from having dried that way, and my hand hurting something fierce. As I got up, though, these things were nothing next to the surprise that awaited me. I stood up and almost tumbled head first over the edge of a ravine. Down below, I could see the bodies of my friends. The lights hadn't taken them anywhere. It appeared the only thing that had taken them was gravity. I stumbled away from the edge of that cliff and went running into the woods. I didn't care about my hand or my pants or anything except the need to get as far away from it as possible. The state police found me 2 days later, dehydrated and starving. My parents, it seemed, had reported me missing, and after they found Dale's truck, the state police and volunteers had begun canvassing the woods. They had almost given up when they found me sleeping next to a tree. They had bundled me up, got me some food, and asked me what happened to Dale and Fred and Clarence. I told them about the lights. I told them about the ravine, but I couldn't begin to tell them where that ravine might be. I told them when I came to, I had seen the bodies of my friends down there and had started running in a panic. They thought for a moment that I might have been responsible for them falling into that ravine, but there was nothing in my background to show that I had any tendencies like that. So they let me go, and a year later, I joined the army and went overseas. They never found the bodies of my friends, and I've been throwing bottles ever since to keep them damn lights away.
I watched him closely as he finished. I wanted him to tell me it was a joke or a goof or something. Instead, Grandpa sat looking into the woods, silent as the grave. He took the bottle out of my numb hands, not even looking at me when he did it, and threw it into the woods. It made a skeletal breaking sound as it hit the tree, which seemed to bring me out of my state. "Why do they fear the sound of breaking glass?" I asked him hesitantly.
I have no idea, son. Grandma, my grandma, might have known, but by the time I saw them, she was 3 years in her grave and too far gone for me to ask.
"Are they the ones that clean up the glass?" It was a question I'd been wondering about for quite some time, and I thought perhaps I had my answer now. Grandpa just shook his head, though.
Heavens, no, not they. That's for... But he stopped, looking at me side-eyed with a gap-toothed grin. But I think that's enough stories for tonight. These old bones are ready for bed.
He got up and went inside, and I followed close behind him. Suddenly, I wasn't so keen on sitting out here by myself. Grandpa and I were sitting at the local flea market, selling his woodwork like any typical Saturday. It was springtime in the Appalachians, and like a bear from its den, the flea market had returned from its long sleep. Despite all the folksy knickknacks and other things for sale at the market, Grandpa usually does pretty well for himself. The tourists really seem to like his intricate bears and beavers and wolves that he carves. He has walking sticks, a favorite amongst the hikers in the area, bowls, key holders, other sort of accent pieces that tourists and locals come back for year after year. Many of his carvings grace the homes of locals, and the crowd around his stall is never fewer than 3 or 4. Grandpa was just finishing chatting with random customers when he suddenly told me that this reminded him of how he and his grandmother used to come to the flea market. "Oh, did she sell magic potions?" I asked, laughing a little at the thought of these super religious stump thumpers picking up love potions and wart begone.
"Sometimes. She also sold herbs, folk remedies, and poultices to people who were in need of them. She never dabbled in things like dream catchers or love potions, things she considered hokey. She only dealt in what she knew, and what she knew came from the woods." His face clouded a little as he thought, and when next he spoke, it was with discomfort. "I almost died here when I was young. Did you know that?" My head snapped around so hard I thought my neck might crack. "What?" "I was old enough to know better than to have let it get that far, but that didn't stop me from nearly getting taken by it."
"Taken by what?" I asked, not sure I wanted to know, but needing to know all the same.
"Soap Sally," and when he said it, the name was almost a whisper. It was as though he was afraid to say it too loudly, lest she be summoned by it.
"Who?" I half laughed, thinking he was joking with me. Grandpa looked shocked.
"Didn't your parents ever tell you about Soap Sally?"
I shook my head. Not that I can ever remember.
"I taught your mother better than that. Soap Sally is dangerous, especially to children."
"Well, you can always tell me about her now." Grandpa nodded, grumbling in disbelief that I'd never heard, and collected his thoughts.
"All of it began with a candle." Grandma handed me a small burlap sack, one of Grandma's little sigils attached to the top. The sigil was to prevent sickness, a simple collection of severe swoops, and I looked up at her questioningly. We had been at the stand all day, selling Grandma's wares, and it wasn't the first time she had sent me out to make a delivery. "Take this to Sybil, would you? She's over by the man selling corn on the far end of the market. Her husband is sick, and she's hoping that this will take away the gloom hovering around him." "Sure," I said, turning to go, but Grandma wasn't quite done yet. "It's nearly sunset, so hurry back. I don't want you getting lost in the end-of-day exodus from this place." "I won't," I promised, and left to find Miss Sybil. I knew who she was, of course. She came around sometimes to get poultices and cures for various things. Though a devout Baptist, Miss Sybil claimed that Dr. Jared's medicine just didn't have the same kick that Grandma's backwoods medicine did. I worked my way through the crowd, stepping quickly around men in boots and overalls as they hauled away everything from animal skins to blades for their harrows. The flea market was a great place to find anything, and I found myself looking at a few booths as I walked past. One of them had some beautiful wooden toys, another selling handmade yo-yos, and a third selling the last of their lead soldiers, lovingly painted to look like Civil War soldiers, for only a penny each. I had a few pennies jingling in my pocket, but as I stepped towards the booth, I knew that Grandma would be mad if I dallied. I'm sure that the booth would be open when Grandma gave me the promised 20 cents at the end of the day. Maybe Miss Sybil would even give me a tip, I thought eagerly. The market was busy, though by the time I reached Miss Sybil's booth, she was preparing to leave. She looked up smiling as she recognized me, and thanked me for coming all this way with her candle. "My husband has been sick for days, and I know he'll be happy to get back to the woods. Here's a little something for your trouble, young man," she said, handing me a few pennies for my trouble. Along with the pennies I had in my pocket, that made 10 whole cents. In that day, that was practically a fortune. As I made my way back, I took a turn towards the table with the lead soldiers. I wanted some new Confederates for the little army I already had at home, and I didn't figure Grandma would be too mad if I made a little detour after her delivery was done. I had just gotten to the end of the row when I heard someone struggling with something. It sounded like a woman, and as I looked towards the outskirts of the West Market, I could see an elderly woman struggling to push a wheeled cart towards the parking lot. I looked back the way I had come, wanting to get to the booth before it closed, but I was a good boy, and I had been raised to help people if they needed help. I approached the old woman and asked if I could help her. She turned to regard me, and I immediately wished I hadn't asked. She was tall, and her width seemed to match her height. She was dressed in a thick coat, much too warm for the day, and a wide-brimmed hat that covered her face in a perpetual shadow. Even so, her face was toadish, oddly long, with skin that looked doughy. She looked like nothing so much as a candle that had grown soft on a warm day. When she smiled, I remembered thinking that her teeth were made of sewing needles, but then I realized that they were just thin and slightly pointed. Everything about her made me suddenly uncomfortable, and I wanted nothing so much as to run away. But, again, I was a good boy, and good boys did not judge people by the way they looked. "Well, aren't you a helpful young man?" she said, her voice sweet but wrong somehow. Her voice seemed unnatural, like a particularly well-done bit of ventriloquism, and it only added to her sense of not rightness. "The wheel is just a little stuck in this rut," she said, showing me the pothole that the delicate wheels of her cart had gotten stuck in. "Do you think you could help me push it? A strong young man like you probably could help me get it loose." I smiled and nodded, pushing one of the sides as the two of us strained against the bulky old cart. It was heavy, the insides rattling with whatever she was selling, and I could smell a flowery smell coming from the inside. I wondered if she was selling flowers, or maybe soap, but as the cart suddenly lunged forward, I stumbled a little and smacked my head against the side of it. I saw stars for a moment and sat down on the red clay with a thump. As she loomed up before me, I could see her doubling in my vision as she offered me a hand. "Are you okay, young man?" I reached out shakily for her hand, telling her I was okay, before her fingers became iron and she settled them around my wrist. I was yanked up, my head spinning, as she began to drag me behind her cart. She was dragging me like a donkey lashed behind a wagon, and I was having trouble getting my thoughts together. My head hurt, my vision swam with tears and wobbles, and I tried feebly to get my hand loose from hers. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't understand why no one was stopping this from happening. These were my friends and neighbors. They knew me. I looked back and saw the blurry masses as they left the market in a crowd, taking their purchases with them. In a way, I suppose that's what this woman was doing. She was taking what she wanted with her, but I found myself wondering if I was a knick-knack for her shelf or something tasty for her pantry. I pulled against her as we neared the edge of the parking lot, afraid that she was going to try to get me in her vehicle. Stranger danger wasn't quite as prevalent as it is now, but everyone knew that you didn't take rides from people you didn't know, and you certainly didn't let people take you anywhere you didn't want to go. I pulled and yelled, telling her to let me go, but her fingers were like an iron band around my wrist. She said nothing, but I could see where she was heading, and it made me realize that things were far worse than I had thought. We weren't going to a beat-up Ford or a sparkly Chrysler. We were going towards the woods where the bad things could live, but the woods were also a place that I knew how to protect myself against. She had my arm extended, pulling me along behind her in that squeaky cart, but my other hand was free to reach up my shirt and find the little sigil that Grandma had made for me. It was similar to the one I had given to Miss Sybil with her candle, but the lines always seemed far angrier on this one. This sigil always said to me, "Stay away, I bite," and it lived up to it. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew that it couldn't be any worse than what would happen if I did nothing. When I pressed it against her hand, the leather thong it was on barely touching, she howled like an animal and snatched her hand away from mine. I fell then, sprawling on my backside for a second time that day, as I held the sigil out towards her like a warning. She looked down at the symbol, and I heard her hiss as she backed into her own cart. You hurt me," she shouted, looking down at her burnt hand. She seemed surprised, like this had never happened to her. "Get away from me! Leave me alone!" I said. The two of us stood for a moment, like a pair of gunslingers before the draw. Then, silently, she slithered back into the woods, the canopy concealing her as she disappeared. I sat there for a few more seconds, my necklace held out before me. Then I stood up, walked towards the market, backpedaling as I kept my eyes on the trees. Grandma found me as I made my way back, and one look was enough to tell her that something had happened. I tried to explain it to her, to describe the lady, but she shushed me as people began to look down at us with concern. She had packed our things in the truck and had come to look for me when I still hadn't shown up. Any idea of stopping at the stalls to look at toys had fled me. All I wanted was to leave, to go home, to be as far from this place as possible. On the way home, Grandma told me about who, or what, I had stumbled across. "She's called Soap Sally, and I haven't seen her in decades. She comes looking for children, usually older children, and drags them to her den. There she kills them and makes soap from their bodies. She leaves the soap for their families, delighting in the idea that they might use it to wash their hands or their bodies. She's a hateful, spiteful old spirit, but unfortunately, she's quite powerful. I had hoped never to see her again in this region, but it appears I may have to slap her nose again." Grandma was gone for a few days after that, but when she returned, she told me that I wouldn't have to worry about that one again. I never saw that old hag ever again, but sometimes, when I smell floral soap, or certain kinds of potpourri, I remember that day at the market, and remember how weak and helpless I felt in the clutches of that one. It's not a memory I like to dwell on. The two of us sat behind our table,
the crowd bustling around us as we both shivered in unison. "That sigil you were talking about," I asked. "Can you show me how to make one?" Grandpa grinned. "I'll make it our next lesson, kid." I had learned a little something about Grandpa's ways since his last story, but learning how to protect myself against the darker things in the forest sounded like something useful to know. It's been a rough couple of days at Grandpa's house. As the summer creeps across the land, the rains have been heavier than usual this season. It seems like the grass needs cutting every weekend, and this weekend it looked more like hay than grass. It's my own fault. Grandpa and I have been busy with the flea market stall lately, and the house looks pretty shabby because of it. So, one Sunday morning, I took it upon myself to put the house and the yard in order. The grass in the yard was nearly as high as I was, and it seemed the best place to start. When I came to live with Grandpa, he showed me the mower he had in the shed, and I remember rolling my eyes at the ancient old thing. It was a push mower, something Grandpa called a Flintstone, and after a few days of shoving it around, I begged him to buy something with a motor. Grandpa laughed about it, but there was a brand new push mower in the shed next time I went to go mow the grass. As I set to work now, I kinda wished I'd asked for a rider instead. I was pushing the hateful engine through the tall grass when I hit something and nearly fell over the front bars. Looking up, I wondered how I had missed the sparkling bottles that protruded from the scraggy grass. Grandpa's yard was full of such weird ornaments, gnomes and bird baths and things like the tinkling sculpture I had run into. It wasn't until I pulled the mower back, though, that I heard the cracking and realized I had damaged it. The glass around the sculpture may have been high, but the grass around it was short and freshly cut. When the bottles collided with the ground, they burst in a small explosion of angry glass. I reached out a hand, meaning to right the thing, and was suddenly enveloped by the worst pain of my life. I looked down to see if I'd stepped in glass, wobbling around as I slapped at my skin. It felt like glass shards were piercing me all over, and I worried for a moment that I had stirred up some ground wasps. It was every piece of glass from the broken bottles was making its way into my skin. I wobbled towards the house before falling onto the freshly cut lawn. When I came back to myself, Grandpa was standing over me. "You okay, son?" "Yeah," I groaned, my skin still burning as I slapped at it. I guess the sun got to me or something. I remembered the thing that I had broken and pointed at the remains of the shattered sculpture. "Sorry, Grandpa, I think I broke your sculpture or something." He looked over at the pile of glass and wood, and the color drained from his shriveled face. "Oh no," came a whisper, and it sounded as frail as a dried leaf. For a man his age, Grandpa gets around surprisingly well. Today he was nearly running as he went over to the thing. He went to the weird whatever it was and lifted it up so he could inspect the bottles. I got to my feet and came up behind him, and it was only then that I noticed the colors. Most were blue, but there were some green ones and some brown ones, maybe a clear one or two. Grandpa sucked in a hissing breath, and I could see that the ends of many were jagged and smashed. "This is bad, son," he said, and when he looked at me, his eyes were full of sorrow. "What do you mean? I see you break bottles almost every night of the week." "Yeah, but not these bottles," Grandpa hedged, lifting the thing and placing it back into the ground. He set about replacing the broken bottles and putting them in a nearby wheelbarrow. I reached out to help him, but he caught my wrist and pushed it away politely. I watched him go about his work, and when the wheelbarrow was full, he wheeled it beside the house and out of sight. He came back with a box that rattled a little and started walking around replacing the bottles I'd broken. "Grandpa, what's going on?" "Well, son, you broke my bottle tree." "Your what?" I asked, unfamiliar with the word. "Dear Lord, have you never heard of a bottle tree?" he asked, looking at me as though scandalized. "No, I don't believe I've ever heard of one until today." This seemed to anger him even more. "Has my daughter forgotten everything? She doesn't teach you about bottle trees or crickets at Christmas or anything." He put the last bottle on a little too hard, and when the neck broke and sent it spilling to the ground, he picked it up and threw it in the woods. I thought you said—" "Doesn't matter, that was a clean bottle anyway." "Clean?" I asked, but Grandpa was in a hurry. He had begun stomping off towards the house, muttering under his breath as he mounted the stairs. I stared after him, catching him easily, but he put out a bony hand to stop me before I could take a single step onto the porch.
Oh no, not yet. No way you're bringing them spirits into my house. You wait here till I get my bag. Make yourself useful while you wait and bury those bottles in the side yard. I asked him why, but he just said there would be plenty of time to talk while we walked to the river. With no answer forthcoming, I shrugged and set about burying the bottles in the wheelbarrow. By the time they were all buried, Grandpa had returned with a satchel and a determined look on his face. Come on then, best we get started. Get started with what? I asked, feeling my frustration mounting. I had broken some weird piece of art that just sat out in the yard. What the hell was going on? The way he sounded, it was like I had desecrated the altar at the Baptist church. You're cleansing. We need to do it before nightfall. Otherwise, things may get very bad for you. He had turned to go, his heading taking us towards the woods, but when I threw the shovel down, he jumped a foot in the air. But why? Why do I need to be cleansed? What the hell did I do? Grandpa sighed, his eyes already judging the sun as he thought about the best way to explain. If you come with me, I'll tell you everything along the way, but we have to hurry. What's waiting for you tonight would make the cricket I had in my head look like a fond memory. I was left with very few options, and Grandpa had never steered me wrong before. I followed him into the woods with only the slightest hesitation. Once we were beneath the canopy of the Georgia woods, I felt safe enough to ask him what was so important about the bottle tree I had wrecked. You remember when I taught you about spirits and how to get them out of your house? Well, a bottle tree is a good way to do just that. Oftentimes, spirits travel from the place where they were released, scared and angry, and that's how they become trapped in people's houses. The bottles confuse them, though. They give them somewhere else to go. They see the blue bottles and think that they're going towards the sky, or the green bottles and believe they're going towards the trees. Once inside, however, the spirit is trapped and it can't get out. How exactly are they dumb enough to get stuck in a bottle? I asked. Grandpa laughed, stepping under a branch that I was forced to shove aside. The spirit is confused after being ejected from the body. Not all spirits become dark. Some are just good people trying to move on, who get a little lost along the way. Whatever the case, the spirits get trapped in the bottle, and when the sun rises, they burn up. Spirits can't remain on the living world once the sun rises, and they must be safe in their graves or get cast out. We crossed the first stream we came to, but Grandpa waded through and kept going. Clearly, this was not the river he was looking for, so we plunged on into the Appalachian wilderness. Granddad seemed to know where we were going, at least, and as the sun began to make its way in the other direction, I followed him. So, if the sun dissolves them, what exactly do I have to worry about? Well, the spirit's remains coat the inside of the bottle. They're gone, but not quite forgotten. There's an old story about a woman whose husband had a bottle tree, and when she washed the bottles, she loosed vengeful spirits into their house. Lord knows why she wanted to wash old bottles, but for all intents and purposes, you've done something very similar. We came to another river, this one full of snowmelt, but he only looked for a fallen tree so he could cross. What are we looking for out here exactly? I asked as Grandpa shoved over a small deadfall and shimmied across. We're going to a place your grandma showed me. It was where she got the water that healed the cricket out of me, and I feel it will be sufficient to draw the spirits out of you, too. And what makes you think there are spirits in me? I found you in the yard, son. You can't tell me that you didn't feel something. I couldn't deny it, and that was all the answer he needed. How do you know all this anyway? I asked him, my hand sticky with pine tar as I finished scurrying over the deadfall. Don't tell me you broke a bottle tree in your youth. Nope, Grandpa said, wiping his own hands on the grass. But a cousin of mine did. Oh, what happened to him? Well, he didn't die, but he probably wished he had at the time. I sighed. I guess we'll need something to do till we get there. Let's have another story, Gramps. Grandpa chuckled. You may regret that after you hear it. As the sun sank lower and lower, my legs growing sorer and sorer, Grandpa began his tale. His name was Clint, and he was my mother's sister's son. How many cousins do you have exactly? I asked. Well, let's see. Your great-grandmother had 8 siblings, and your great-grandfather had 7, so
He pretended to count on his fingers before turning and saying, "Way too damn many. May I continue or not?" I told him to proceed, and so he began. Cousin Clint was visiting for a few weeks. We were exploring the woods around where I lived. Clint was from the woods too, but his mother lived in Arkansas, and his woods were a little different than mine. He wasn't a fool. He knew his way around the woodlands, but his upbringing had lacked the spiritual nature that my grandmother had exposed me to. So, when we came across the old Ruckman Cemetery, Clint merely saw a boneyard to explore. We were tossing a ball back and forth, a little more than the guts of a baseball, really, when the dirty stone perimeter of the family cemetery rose up from the woods like old teeth. The Ruckmans were an old family that had once lived in that part of the holler. They were gone by the time I was born, their farmland reclaimed by the forest, but their headstones remained, as did some stone fence that marked their burial ground. Aside from those crumbling stones, several bottle trees were also in attendance. Some of them were little more than crumbling relics from the farm days, but many still stood displaying their bottles proudly. Clint knew what they were. His mother had bottle trees in her garden, too. It was clear, though, that he didn't believe in them. They were just something superstitious to him, and as he tossed the ball back and forth, he walked closer and closer to the low stone gate. I told him not to get too close. I told him that all kinds of nasty things might attach themselves to him if he got too close, but he just laughed and said that was stupid. Dead things stay dead. That's what they do. Before I could disagree, he told me to throw a long one and ran. I launched the ball in a high arc, but I saw what was about to happen before Clint did. He was running backwards, and he never saw the bottle tree that he slammed into. It shattered underneath him when he fell on it, and I ran to help him before he cut himself too badly. When Clint screamed, I assumed he had gotten into the glass. When he started to shake, I knew it was something else. I pulled him off the bottle tree as best I could and was surprised to find that he didn't have a scratch on him. The way he was flopping around, I thought he was probably hurt bad. When I saw no blood, though, I wondered what exactly had made him scream like that. He came around soon enough, and when I asked him what had happened, he said he must have hit his head. God, it hurt so much, though. I don't know what it was, but it hurt like fire. I checked him over, but we were losing the sun by then. It was late afternoon, and we needed to get home before supper got cold. So we set out, Clint stumbling a little as we headed for home, and me keeping an eye on him. He seemed a little woozy, but I didn't think much of it as we made our way over the familiar hills and through the hollers. It began as an itch. Clint began to scratch his arms, slapping at himself as though bugs were on him. I asked him if he were okay. He said it felt like something was biting him, and he wondered if maybe he hadn't blundered into some poison ivy. The further we went, the more his itching became pain. Clint staggered as the sun rode low, saying he must have gotten some glass into him when he fell. He said it felt like his insides were on fire, and I had to throw an arm over him to see if I could help him get back to the house so someone could look him over. He began to scream again the closer we got to home, and as we burst into the yard, I could already feel my shirt getting wet with something. I looked down to find him oozing blood from a dozen wounds. I let him drop to the ground, and as he fell, he began to scream and writhe. It was as if he had fallen on a porcupine, and when I ran from my mother, I wasn't sure I would see him alive again. Mama came on the run, Daddy too, and my aunt was right behind them as they came to see what was wrong with Clint. His skin oozed blood like small red rivulets, and we could do little but watch him bleed with no idea how to stop it. Until, that is, Mama told me to go get Grandma, and I went on the run. The longer I listened to the story, the more scared I became. When he first spoke about the itch, the sun was still high in the west, but as it sank lower and lower, I started to feel like ants were crawling on me. I slapped and checked myself for bugs, but Grandpa just went right on with his story. If he noticed at all, I mean. I couldn't understand what was going on, but the longer we walked, the more I felt like the itch was becoming a burning under my skin. At first it was like a sunburn. It itched and burned and was irritated, but the feeling wasn't too bad. It made the feeling of my jeans rubbing against my legs truly irritating though, and my shirt felt like it was made out of twine instead of cotton. Was this how Clint had felt as he left the graveyard for home? When would I start to bleed out of every pore? How long would I have before I could no longer control my legs and Grandpa would have to carry me? "Are you okay, son?" Grandpa asked, and I nodded and told him to go on. Grisly story as it was all that was keeping me distracted from the itch and the building of the burning. "Grandma met me at the door. I never thought of it as a kid, but Grandma always seemed to have some sort of sixth sense about these things. I thought then that it was just how old people were, but now I understand that it was her way. She knew when she was needed, and she was ready to help when the need arose. She had a shoulder bag on, this one that I'm wearing actually, and she told me to show her the way. I led her back to the house and was glad to hear Clint screaming when I got there. Grandma looked at him and asked what had happened out in the woods today. Nothing, I told her. We were playing with a ball and exploring the woods, and then But that's when I remembered the bottle tree. Clint fell on a bottle tree over by the Ruckman cemetery. Grandma was in her bag in an instant. Hold him down. He's not going to like this. They held him down, none of them asking questions, as she called me over and showed me the bottle of river water. I say a bottle, but it was more like a pitcher. It held a large wax seal on top, and when she uncorked it, the water shimmered like a trout's scales. From a stream I know of. I'll show you sometime, she promised, before turning and dumping the water over Clint. He stilled in his squirming for a moment, at least until the glass started breaking his skin. He stopped then, and I realized we had arrived. It, may be best if you not listen to the next part before we're done. I had itched and burned for the last hour of the hike, but the sight of the river took my breath away. It was like looking at a fish as it wriggled on the ground, its gorgeous scales shimmering in the dying daylight. It called me as I watched it flow, begging me to drown myself in it. "Climb in," Grandpa said, his eyes straying to the burning line of the sky. "Climb in while there's still daylight." I started to take my shirt off, but Grandpa sighed. "There's no time for that." For someone so old, his hands were oddly strong as he shoved me into the river. Just like Clint, the water seemed to stop my burning and itching, but I could feel something else just below my skin. Then, the pain that flashed across my body made the pain from earlier seem like a daydream. It felt like knives were being born from my flesh. It felt like someone was pulling teeth out of my skin. I can't properly explain what it felt like, but I watched as the shards of colored glass slid out of me. They came out like sewing needles, some of the slivers looking as long as my pinky finger, and as they came out, they dissolved into sparkling motes of color. My breath felt trapped inside me, my hands shaking as they fought against the current that tried to pull me down. I felt stabbed 1,000 times and was not aware when it finally ended. I passed out well before then. I woke up by a fire, my clothes drier and my body no longer aching. "I didn't think you were ever gonna let go of that bank," Grandpa said, making me jump a little. "I'd wager you still have some soil under your nails." I lay there, still trying to come to terms with what I'd seen. It appeared that Appalachia was full of more mysteries than I could imagine. "You did well. I wasn't sure you would, but I don't think the spirits in my bottle tree were as bad as Clint's. The graveyard had existed for hundreds of years or more, and there was no telling what sort of hateful spirits had gotten holed up in there." Did he live?" I asked, a little afraid of how weak I sounded. He did, and thankfully he didn't remember any of it. I suspect that he blocked it all out, but he wouldn't go near a cemetery for the rest of his life. He was cremated when he died. He refused to let them put him in the family plot." He looked up as a log popped, watching the embers drift up as he smiled contentedly to himself. "This reminds me of the night I met a Sasquatch out here. I was out here drinking but I never even heard how it began. I was snoring before he even got past the setup, hoping this was the longest day I'd ever have in the Georgia hills." Grandpa and I spent a few nights in the woods after the incident with the bottle tree. As good as I had felt the night before, my legs weren't quite up for the hike back just yet. So, we spent 2 nights in the woods while I recovered. It wasn't uncomfortable, not really. I grew up camping, but Grandpa liked to camp a little rough. I had thought to myself plenty of times when I was a kid that I was camping rough, scoffing at my parents and their pop-up camper as I slept in my sleeping bag in a pup tent. That was real camping after all, I told myself. And as I listened to the wildlife make noises through the thin layer of fabric, I felt like a real outdoorsman. Now that I was lying out here on a bed of leaves with the cicadas in my ears and the bats catching mosquitoes overhead, I learned that I hadn't been prepared for what I thought was rough camping. Wednesday night found me sitting by the fire, keeping it fed as the darkness gathered into full night. Grandpa had gone to relieve himself in the woods, and the smell of our cooking fish as they crisped over the little wooden spit fire made my stomach growl in hunger. Grandpa swore I'd probably be able to make it back to the house by tomorrow morning, and my legs were starting to feel a lot better. I turned the fish as I sat and waited, hearing the fire crackle and the nightlife carry on their noisy chorus. When something else cracked, I turned my head to the left and froze like a deer in headlights. The woods around us were dark, but the gloom did nothing to hide the 2 large pair of lilac eyes that stared at me through the trees. I locked eyes with the creature, the 2 of us held in the gaze of the other. This wasn't out of any misplaced sense of courage or desire to cow this thing that was staring me down. I felt as enchanted by those eyes as I was scared by them, and my hands slid up to clutch the little ward that Grandpa had shown me how to make. I didn't know if it would do anything against the creature, but I knew that I would need everything I could get my hands on if it decided to attack. We had been staring at each other for a few minutes, my eyes beginning to water, when something crunched down on a bush not too far away from the campsite, and both of us looked at the source of the noise. Grandpa came stumping back into the camp then, and I looked back to the place where the eyes had been to see that they were gone. "Those fish are looking a little more burnt than I strictly like 'em, son," Grandpa said, sitting down and flipping them over. "Grandpa," I said in a half whisper, "I saw something over there." Grandpa turned his head, almost lazily, and smiled after only a precursory glance. "That's so? Did you attract the attention of a boo hag or something?" "Whatever it was, it had purple eyes," I said, poking at the fire as it started to burn down. Grandpa looked up from the fish like a robin smelling a cat. "Purple eyes? Are you sure?" "Absolutely. They were really light purple too, like violets or lilacs or something." Just then, Grandpa turned back to the woods and cupped his hands over his mouth, loosing a call that sounded like an angry chipmunk. He listened, staring out into the darkness as he searched for something. He made the call again, but it sounded less sure the second time. I just watched it all unfold and sat in a state of extreme confusion. Was he calling to the thing with the purple eyes? Was he calling it to us? When something called back, the sound was a little higher than the one Grandpa had made. Something approached us through the bushes, the sound hitting my ears differently than the glumping Grandpa had made in his approach. I imagined it was something like what a fish heard when another fish cut through the water near it. It was whispery, almost ethereal, and it made my skin crawl a little. Then it spoke, and I felt like I might shudder right out of my body.
"Is that you, Fisher?"
"It is. Is that you, Glimmer?" When the creature stepped out of the woods, I thought for a moment that Grandpa had been playing a joke on me. Maybe this had been the cue for a friend of his to come out of the woods so they could have a good laugh at scaring me. The woman that came out looked normal enough. She wore leathers that might be a little too tight for the weather, and her silvery hair was pulled back into an intricate tail that spilled down her back. Her eyes were purple, the lightest of lilacs, and when she smiled, I could see rows of bright white teeth. It wasn't until she stepped closer that I saw those teeth were pointed. just like the ears that rose from the back behind her silvery hair.
It's good to see you again, Fisher. You still look as handsome as the last time I saw you.
I looked over at Grandpa, who cleared his throat and drew the attention of the beautiful creature. "Over here, Glimmer." Glimmer turned her head and gasped as though startled.
Fisher? What happened to you? You look shriveled as my great-gran.
"You charmer, you," Grandpa said, clearly trying not to let it get to him. "You look exactly the way you did the last time I saw you."
She smirked, looking back at him.
Well, it was only 50 years ago. It's not like it was very long.
55 to be exact, but who's counting?
Glimmer took a half step towards him, but came back for a second look and to slide a hand over my cheek.
You look so much like Fisher when he was young,
she went on, before sitting down on the ground next to Grandpa. She slid her alabaster hands over his wrinkled skin and laughed as the flesh moved under her touch. Grandpa didn't seem to mind, and she turned his head as she did the same to his cheeks. She laughed as she noticed his gray hair, and he smiled as he watched her admiring him.
What has happened to you, Fisher?
"I got old, my dear. It happens to the best of us if we're lucky. This is my grandson, actually."
She snorted, sounding like this was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard.
Your son, maybe, but there is no way this one could be your grandson.
"Sad but true," Grandpa said.
I sat and watched the two of them, her studying him and Grandpa accepting it with humor before asking the question. "So," I thought about the best way to phrase this so as not to offend the sharp-toothed woman who had rolled up out of the woods all of a sudden. "Who exactly is this?" Glimmer pinched Grandpa's cheeks playfully.
You never told him about me, Fisher?
"I did, as it happens, though he may not remember it," Grandpa said, giving me a little wink.
I thought back, trying to remember all the stories that Grandpa had told me in the past year, and finally landing on the answer. "Wait, is this the moon child you said you met in the woods?" Grandpa cackled, but Glimmer made it sound like a seal who's got a fish stuck in its throat.
A moonchild? Are you still telling people that's what I am?
"Well, most people can't pronounce what your people call each other. It's what I've called you since I was a kid, and you've never stopped me."
"Wait, I believe you told me that there was a story there for later. You didn't want to interrupt your story about the widow's candle, though."
"Good memory, kid. I suppose that now is as good a time as any to tell you, though."
Glimmer let go of his face and reclined by the fire instead, the light making her skin look like pale milk.
I do so love the tale of our meeting, Fisher. I was such a wild little thing back then.
"In that," Grandpa said with a wink, "you haven't changed much, Glimmer."
Grandpa made himself comfortable, preparing for another tale, as he looked into the fire that danced before him.
"Well, it all started with some fish I had pulled out of the river on that fateful camping trip. I had hiked off into the woods, as you know, to camp for the weekend. This was Friday afternoon, and I had arrived around mid-afternoon and started fishing. The stream was swollen from snowmelt, and the fish were in high spirits that season. I could have probably plucked them right out of the water with my hand, but I set about with my pole and my night crawlers, and soon I had a mess of fish hanging from a nearby tree. As dark approached, I had my fire built and my sleeping place laid out with a camp blanket. I had caught plenty of fish, 10 in all, and had decided to scatter the remains back into the river so I didn't attract a hungry bear or anything. These were fat river brim, too, and my mouth watered as the smell of them cooking assaulted my nostrils. I had turned to get something from my pack, and that's when I heard the rustling. I turned back, reaching for my knife, but there was really nothing to see. I had mistaken the fire popping for a rustling noise, and I bent down to turn the fish. I had all the fish on wooden spikes, and they were crisping nicely over the fire. I had a heel of hard bread and some cheese to go with it, and I was anticipating quite a dinner. Nothing works up an appetite like a good hike, after all. It wasn't until I had turned all the fish that I noticed I had been robbed. Instead of 10 fat brim, I only had 9. Someone had taken one of my fish, one of the end ones, and I glanced around to make sure it hadn't just fallen over. It wasn't in the dirt, and it wasn't in the fire, and I couldn't imagine that it had wriggled back to the stream all on its own. So I sat back down and picked up a stick I had meant to be whittling that evening. The fire ate the shavings happily as I fed it, but my eyes scanned mistrustfully around for whoever had taken my fish. Like I told you before, the woods were known to have tramps, and most of them weren't above a little sneak thievery if it meant not starving. I would have probably shared my fish with them if they'd asked, but Daddy had always had harsh opinions on thieves, and they were opinions that I shared. Even at 10, I was prepared to defend myself if I needed to, though I figured I would just run if they came after me in force. A few fish were worth less than my life, and wasn't so foolish as to go spoiling for a fight. When I heard the bushes to my left rattle, I turned and saw something take off quickly as it moved around like a caged cat. It rustled bushes around the clearing in quick succession, its movements making me think it might be a coyote or even a big cat like the ones I'd heard about in town. As I sat by the fire, thinking about how it would feel to get jumped on by one of those big mountain cats, I remember how they said it had butchered Claire's sheep as they sat afield one night. It had ripped them open, eaten their soft parts and leaving their bodies all husked out. They later discovered that it was a wolf pack, but I wouldn't know that for a few more weeks. That night, I felt the fear creep up my spine as I felt stalked by this terrible phantom. Then, from a break in the bushes, I saw a pair of purple eyes. They studied me the way I studied animals I'd come upon on hikes sometimes. Animals caught by surprise a second before they bolted into the woods, never to be seen again. Those eyes looked at me just that way. They stared as if they didn't expect they would be allowed to observe me for very long. We stared at each other for a while, the fire crackling between us, and it wasn't until I heard the hiss of a fish sliding into the coals that I shook off the strange spell. When I looked back up, I expected the eyes would be gone, but they were still there. "Who's there?" I asked, blowing the soot off the fish as I took out my knife and began flaking back the scales. The eyes blinked, but they never answered. "Would you like to come and share some fish?" I asked, thinking maybe the eyes belonged to a person. They didn't seem so big as a cat would, and they looked curious rather than scary. They had probably smelled my fish and come to see what smelled so good, and now that they had decided I wasn't dangerous, they would want more. The eyes blinked again, and I could almost feel them weighing their options. Did they dare to come and see if I was actually dangerous? "I won't hurt you," I added, realizing that that's probably exactly what something that would hurt them would say. Their curiosity seemed to win out, however, because to my surprise, a wild little girl came crawling out on all fours. That was the first time I met Glimmer.
Glimmer laughed, and it sounded like wind chimes under a waterfall.
He speaks as though we're not a grubby little creature sitting out in the woods cooking something I have never smelled before. I was curious and came to have a taste. And then he spoke. Imagine my surprise to discover that this thing could talk.
Had you ever seen a human before?" I asked. Glimmer shook her head.
I had heard them in the woods, but my kind do not usually go so close. We have lived in these woods since your kind hunted with bows and arrows. They rode horses instead of... automacars?
"They're called cars now, Glimmer," Grandpa said kindly.
Yes, those. My parents tell me that we were once friends with the ones who came before you, kind. The ones who used the bows. They knew of us, but they warned us about the new people. They told us you all were violent, but I never felt fear about this one.
Grandpa smiled back, and I couldn't help smiling as well. How close had these two become? I couldn't help but think. Grandma must have been quite a woman to take Grandpa away from this one. Anyway, I haven't even gotten to the best part yet, Grandpa said. Glimmer flapped her hands at him.
Continue then,
she said, scooting closer to my leg as she lay her hands against the log I was sitting on.
I have the perfect spot to listen from.
I felt my face heat up a little as Grandpa went on with his story. She approached my fire boldly, sniffing the air like a silver-haired hunting cat as she hunched in the dancing light. She was like a coiled spring, ready to snap away from me at any sign of attack. She was equal parts distrust and curiosity, and I had never seen anything like her. My hands shook a little as I offered her the fish I had been scaling, but she shook her head and pointed at the one still in the fire.
I prefer them with the scales on. The scales taste good.
Her voice made me shiver. It was like listening to a river speak, like hearing a babbling brook talk, and I passed her one of the other fish instead. My hands shook as I extended it toward her, staying out of the fire, and when her hand touched mine, it felt like fresh baby skin. She snatched the fish away, sitting on her haunches as she ate. True to her word, she ate it scales and all, and her sharp little teeth slipped the bones away as she chewed them as well. She ate the whole fish, tail, head, eyes, and fins and all, and I saw her looking greedily at the remains of my own fish before I threw it to her. She caught it easily and began eating it too as I grabbed a fresh fish. Before long, the fish were gone, and she was relaxed a little as she cleaned up the remains of my dinner.
This was a fine meal, Fisher,
she said, sucking the grease from her fingers as I went back to whittling. That's not my name, I said with a little chuckle. My name's... But she came very close as she watched my hands going about their absent-minded task. I had been whittling away without much thought as this little creature had stalked me, and when I looked down, I noticed I had a little cat. He wasn't completely done yet, but he was starting to take shape. His ears and feet were plain enough to see, at least.
What are you doing? Is it...
But whatever she had said, it sounded like bees buzzing in my brain, because I flinched and almost dropped the cat into the fire. She noticed my cringe and took a step back, her cautiousness resurfacing. It's called whittling, I said, showing her the cat. My dad showed me how. She came a little closer and watched in amazement as the cat was finagled more and more from the wood. I watched her out of the corner of my eye, the fire turning her into a china doll. Her skin was so pale, her hair like spun wire, and despite being a mess, it was still very pretty. She was dressed in what looked like a nightshirt, and it was covered in dirt and cockleburrs. I didn't care, though. I had never seen anything like her, and I made a mental note of her so I could ask Grandma about her when I got home. As the cat came free of the wood, she made an excited noise and grabbed for it, uncaring of my knife.
It's beautiful, Fisher. You are a man of many talents.
She sat by the fire, inspecting the little cat as a yawn coursed its way up my throat.
What was that?
She asked, trotting the little cat across the leaves as she made it stalk the sticks and twigs. Just a yawn. I guess I'm feeling a little tired, I said, sitting back and watching her at play.
Tired already? But the sun just went down.
I yawned again. I was just so damn tired, and when I blinked, she had walked her tiger across the grass. That's when I started to hear an angry voice bellowing, something like a startled bear, and she stiffened like a spooked cat.
I have to go. Daddy's looking for me.
She paused at the edge of the clearing, and when the moon hit her just right, her pale skin shone like diamonds.
I'd like to see you again,
she said suddenly, turning and looking at me as her skin shone like a lantern. I'd like to see you too, I said, realizing I was just as curious about her as she was about me. How do I find you? She thought about it and then smiled with her mouth of sharp little teeth.
Make this sound if you want to see me.
Then she made a sound like an angry chipmunk in a high wind, and the noise set my hair on end.
That's my name. Call me some night if you like.
I tried to tell her I would, but all that came out was a huge yawn and a muffled, "Good night, Glimmer." She smiled at me then, and as the fire went out, she disappeared into the woods. I wondered if I'd ever see her again, and thankfully, I did.
Glimmer was smiling as he finished, her head against my leg as she remembered their first meeting.
Quite a few more times as I recall.
Rising to her feet and dusting herself off.
"Leaving so soon?" Grandpa asked.
Sorry, Fisher. I've got to get back. But I was very glad to see you and your grandson. Call me again some night, though. I would very much like to see you again.
She paused and looked back at me as she added,
Both of you.
Then she was gone. Grandpa sighed. "She's something else, isn't she?" I nodded, a little lost for words. When I asked Grandma about her, she said that Glimmer was something hard to pronounce and older than the native people. She said that Glimmer sounded like she might be little more than a child, but her people could live for hundreds or even thousands of years. Grandma said she had befriended one or two in her lifetime, but their trust was exceedingly difficult to earn. She told me that if I had managed to earn the friendship of this moon child, then I should count myself very lucky. As we sat back and watched the fire crackle, I considered that I might be lucky too. Had Glimmer not told me that I might call on her as well? Could you teach me how to make that sound, Grandpa? I asked. And Grandpa smiled and said he'd be happy to. Maybe someday I'll tell you of the time I saw her before this. The time I told Glimmer it would be the last time we met. I laughed. Those must have been some extraordinary circumstances. Grandpa smiled as he watched the fire. Yes, well, your grandmother was quite an extraordinary woman.
Today started out pretty weird, and only got weirder. We've been out of the woods for about a week, my legs finally feeling less wobbly, and I was set to putting everything back to rights. Having been gone about 3 days, the dust had taken over again, and the house needed to be aired out. Grandpa had helped with the cleaning as much as he could, and now the house was back to its usual presentable state. When I woke up today, though, I noticed that the sun was high. Normally Grandpa wakes me up early for some sort of adventure, but no one had woken me up today. I went downstairs, expecting to see Grandpa waiting for me, but he was nowhere to be found. I checked the porch, the living room, his bedroom, but it wasn't until I checked the front porch that I found someone. It wasn't Grandpa, but it was someone. He was dressed in a long white coat, his round crown hat as dark as a raven's wing. He had his back to me as he stood looking out into the yard, and the back of his calfskin boots were silver and inlaid with the image of an hourglass in silver. It would have been hard to see if the sun wasn't so high, but I could hardly miss it as the hourglasses winked at me from the back of those boots. He hadn't taken notice of me yet, but I could have hardly missed him. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" The man turned around, and I immediately wished he hadn't. To say that the man was gaunt would not have done him justice. The man looked like a scarecrow with a human skeleton hidden beneath the surface. He was a fantastic piece of Halloween decoration that had learned to walk and talk. He looked like nothing so much as some kind of other's idea of what a person should look like. He was wrong. He had no place in the light of day.
"Hey there, youngster."
I couldn't hide my shudder as he fixed his eyes on me, his words creeping across my skin like bugs.
"I'm a friend of your granddad's. Is he home? I need to ask him something."
"No," I said, the words just kind of spilling out before I could even think about them. I can't seem to find him. I can only assume that he's taken to the woods for whatever reason. Maybe you should go look for him there." He tipped his hat to me and walked casually off into the woods, his white coat visible in the field of green for quite some time. I stood and watched him go, and when I couldn't see him anymore, I made my way back inside. I couldn't even think about cleaning anymore, not after all that, and I set about making a cup of strong tea with some of Grandpa's whiskey mixed in for good measure. I opened the cabinet on the little island and jumped back as something pulled it shut again. I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what had just happened. Was someone hiding in there? Why was someone hiding in the cabinet? I could think of only one person that could be hiding in there, and I was unsurprised to find someone holding the door shut when I tried to open it again. "What are you doing?" I started, but he hissed at me and told me to hush.
Don't give any sign I'm here. He'll know, and he'll find me.
"You mean the guy outside?" I stage whispered, still pretending to make tea.
I told him to check the woods. He's not even... Doesn't matter,
Grandpa said, cutting me off again.
Look, just go about your day and ignore me until dusk. Once the sun goes down, I'll tell you the whole story. But for now, just get out of here.
I sighed, figuring this was just one more thing I'd have to take on faith, and moved off to try to run out the rest of the day. I couldn't help glancing out the window as I worked, and that's the only reason I saw him skulking around out there. At first it was just a glance. I saw that white coat and black hat standing behind a tree, or I'd catch that oblong face out of the corner of my eye and turn to see nothing. Other times it was harder to ignore. I'd see him walk into the side yard, but not come around the back. I'd see him walking around the front yard, but he'd be gone when I went to ask him what he was doing. As the day progressed and the afternoon grew long, his sightings became more and more frequent, and far less friendly. I would often get glimpses of him behind me or to the left of me as I worked in the house. I could feel eyes on me, but I'd turn around to find nothing there. I could feel his hateful gaze on me right up until the sunset and the crickets began to tune up. Then he vanished as suddenly as he'd arrived. I was sitting out on the back porch, a beer sweating in my cup holder, when Grandpa came slowly from the house. He wasn't in his usual put-together state. His hair was mussed, his clothes were dirty, and he kept rubbing his backside as he sat stiffly in his usual porch chair. I handed him a cold beer, and he took a long pull off it before saying anything.
"Thanks, son. It's been a long day," he said as he settled into his chair.
"So," I asked after a few minutes of tactful silence, "want to tell me why you were hiding in your secret compartment in the kitchen?"
"Sure you want to know? Once you know, it's not the sort of thing you can just unknow," he said, tipping me a little wink.
I thought it over for a minute and finally nodded, deciding that I already knew enough terrible stuff, and one more thing probably wouldn't hurt me too badly. On that score, I guess I was wrong.
"Once a year, I receive a visit from the Weldergeist, so he can collect his debt, and every year I manage to avoid paying him."
"So you're welching on a debt now? That doesn't seem like you." Grandpa chuckled.
"Well, to be fair, the Weldergeist is a tricky creature that only appears when he knows you need his help, and he charges a pretty steep fee. He came to me in, well, a moment of weakness, when he knew I would accept his offer, and made me a deal I couldn't refuse. It was a sucker's bet, though, and he knew it. I just had because I have no intention of paying for something that he never really delivered on."
"What was that exactly?" I asked, trying to be casual, but very curious. Grandpa opened his mouth, but instead just looked off into the woods.
That's a story for another day, or maybe never."
"Fair enough," I said, taking another pull off my bottle. "Well, why not just pay him and be done with it?"
"'Cause I promised him the remaining years of my life," Grandpa said.
He said it as offhandedly as you might tell someone you lost a watch in a card game. I spit beer across the porch.
"Why in God's name would you do such a thing?"
Grandpa just shrugged.
"It's not that uncommon for people in the know to make deals with the Weldergeist. The Weldergeist will grant people power, but there's always a price. If you're careful and a little bit clever, you can trick him and pay nothing for his gift."
"Is that why you're hiding?" I asked.
He nodded. "Once a year, the Weldergeist sends you a missive. It tells you that he will come and that your business must be conducted before the sun sets on that day. That means you're safe for a whole year if you can avoid him on that particular day. You were visiting some friends for the weekend when it happened last year, so you probably don't remember me spending the whole day in my hiding spot."
I nodded, taking his words in and rolling them around. I guess it made sense. I knew that Grandpa knew of these strange creatures, But after meeting Glimmer last week, I was coming to understand that he also had a unique relationship with many of them. Grandpa wasn't just some Van Helsing type who fought the monsters. He realized that living in the Appalachians meant living with them and adapting to them. Still, I said, rolling the bottle of beer in between my fingers and warming it, seems an odd way to live sometimes. Grandpa chuckled. I can imagine that it would be. It was strange for me when I was young, too. Grandma kinda introduced me to this strange and sometimes frightening world, and then disappeared just as I was getting used to it. Wait, I said, I thought you said your grandmother died. For all intents and purposes, she did. I suppose it's time I told you about that, since it ties in very closely with the Weldergeist. Feel like a story, kiddo? He asked, tossing the bottle and reaching for another. I told him I did, and he popped the top as he looked off into the woods. This happened when I was about 15. I would look back on it as one of the saddest days of my life. I was coming home from school when I remembered that Grandma had wanted me to come over for lessons that day. I sighed, not really wanting to spend my afternoon in Grandma's kitchen as we pored over dusty old books. I was at that age where I guess I didn't really believe in magic like I used to, and this was all starting to feel a little superstitious. That probably sounds weird, given what I've told you I'd seen, but it's easy to forget the bad times when you're living through the good ones. I still learned the woodsy ways, and I still went with Grandma sometimes when she did her rounds, but I was older now and thinking strongly about using my afternoons for work or for spending time with my friends. But I was a good boy, and I didn't want to let my Grandma down, so I went to her house for my lessons. Despite my doubts, we had a busy time over the last few years. Grandma and I had cleansed a few houses, blessed a few plots of land, and had a nasty encounter with a boo-hag one night in Reverend Tucker's house. I don't think the good Reverend had believed in such things before then, but when Grandma pulled the boo-hag off of him as it attempted to drain his life force, he couldn't very well doubt it. He and Grandma had come to a shaky sort of friendship, despite Grandma keeping her own sort of ways. Why depend on the good Lord for everything when you can do for yourself, Grandma often said. Poor fella has enough on his plate without having to worry about me. I saw Grandma's house as I came up the road, but it was the man that caught my eye first. I say man, but, well, you've seen him. He's no man, that's certain. He was dressed in a long white peacoat, his head crowned with a dark hat like a cattleman. He wore these boots, but I saw silver on the back before I saw the soft calfskin of them. They had hourglasses on them, and the sand almost seemed to run through them as the sun caught them. He turned as I approached, and I stopped when his presence fell on me. He was just wrong. His body was like someone wearing another person's skin. His face bulged in places that a normal face shouldn't. His whole posture and geometry made my eyes water a little, and I couldn't understand how he could exist at all. He smiled when he saw me, and the look made me think of a wild animal that had gotten a pair of dentures from the garbage. "Hey there, youngster. I'm looking for your grandmother. She's an old friend of mine, and we're supposed to meet to discuss some things. You wouldn't know where she is, would you?" I couldn't find the words right away, so I just shook my head. "That's a shame," he said, sounding bored rather than mournful. "Well, if you should find her." Then he turned away and looked around like she might be standing just behind a tree or something. "I don't," but he turned, and I had to force the words past my teeth. "I don't remember ever seeing you before. How do you know my grandmother?" He turned back towards me, and I suddenly wished I'd just let him leave. He came closer this time, bending down so he could come to eye level with me. He was pretty tall, or
I was short for 15 maybe, and when he bent, I heard a sound like a tree limb groaning in a high wind. It was an unhealthy sound, the kind that bones make just before they break. "That is an interesting question," he said, his breath smelling like something rotten. "I suppose your grandma and I met when she was about your age. She needed something, and I had it, so we made a deal. Your grandma's tried to escape that deal for a very long time, but I'm sure I'll collect what I'm owed one of these days." He was very close to my face, and I felt like a rabbit trapped in the side of a predator. I was not a small teenager, 5'5" and muscled from working in the woods and helping my daddy, but this man made me feel like a toddler. Even bent at the knee, I felt like he could unhinge his jaw and simply swallow me up. As he smiled at me, I felt sure I could see something moving beneath his skin. Not bones, but something like bugs, or hell, I don't know. I was young and full of myself, but this wasn't the first time I had been face to face with something I could neither fight nor understand. Suddenly I was a young boy who was watching a monstrous cat as it peeked at him through my front door, and I didn't like it. "Maybe you'd like to make a deal. Is there something you desire, youngster? Maybe a woman you fancy who won't give you the time of day? Maybe you'll require wealth, prestige, power." He said the last like it was something both sexual and dark. The word felt like the thing I sometimes thought about late at night as I lay in bed. It felt like the decadent cake my mom made sometimes. I suddenly wanted to roll in it as this terrible stranger watched. Suddenly, the man didn't seem so terrible to me. I could see myself with Kathy Marty on my arm, the prettiest girl in the valley, with a pocket full of money and a brand new Ford to parade around town in. More than that, I could see myself living without the fear I had held for spirits and woodland devils and all the other things that went bump in the night. Behind that power, I could see this creature hunkered, and the idea was no longer so terrible. "I can make all that happen. I can bring it all to you, make it yours, but only after we make a little deal." He had extended a hand to me, and I had reached shakily out to take it. That was when my grandmother's voice cut across my foggy mind like a cleaver through a calf's brain. "Get away from him," she growled, and I could see that she was standing on the front porch. Had she always been there? Had both of us just completely missed her? She was dressed in a long black dress, a sundress of some kind, and even at her age she stood tall and proud. She stared at the thing that I had no name for at the time, and seemed to dare it to lay a finger on me. "Why, Elizabeth Gretchen Chambry, if it isn't my old friend. I'm so glad that you have agreed to come and conclude our business. Let's go inside then, and see it put to rest." "Very well," she said, stepping off the porch and in between us. "I would like a word with my grandson first, however." "Of course," he said, walking onto the porch, but keeping a careful eye on Grandma as he went. "Do hurry, though. Places to be, people to see." Grandma wrapped me in a hug, her smell enveloping me as she whispered into my ear. Her voice was the most frantic I had ever heard it, and she seemed to be trying to tell me as much as possible in as low a tone as possible. It was clear she didn't want the man to hear us, and I couldn't blame her one bit. All the haze had fled from me, and I was aware again of his dubious geometry. Run home right away, and don't look back. If that man comes to you again, don't let him trap you like he's trapped me. I love you, boy. Keep your studies and make me proud. Now go and don't look back." I ran then, showing my heels up the road and not stopping until I was back inside my house. I was crying on the front porch when my mother found me, and I wouldn't tell her why. A powerful assuredness had come over me, and I knew what I would next find when I went to my grandmother's house.
A night bird sounded off in the woods somewhere, and the return call sounded spooky amidst the sound of crickets. Grandpa launched another bottle into the woods, and I heard it shatter as it hit the tree somewhere out there. I expected he would reach for another, but he just sat there and stared out into the woods. She was hiding from him for years, but it was my fault that he caught her. She could have lived for years and years, but I had to go and get involved. As far as I was concerned, I had killed her. I found her sitting at the table the next day. She was just sitting there, looking so peaceful, her eyes staring and glassy. They wanted to bury her, but her will was very clear. I put her ashes in the valley next to Renoir's tree. That was the summer I started drinking, about 1.5 years before the lights killed my friends. The two of us sat there in silence, listening to the forest hum. If you knew what he was, why did you make the deal? Grandpa didn't seem to want to answer, and I had decided that he wasn't going to, when finally he whispered,
You wouldn't understand until you've lost someone, like I've lost someone. You can't know what you would trade for them back."
He got up then, saying he was tired and heading off to bed. I sat on the porch and mulled that one over for quite some time. We were watching TV one night, Grandpa in his chair and me in Grandma's old rocker. I sighed heavily. It had been a long day. Grandpa had me mending fences most of the day, a job that required 2 trips to town, the hauling of some heavy material, and a lot of sweating in the afternoon sun. Of course, Grandpa hadn't done any of that except for the riding into town. What he had done was mostly sit on a big rock and watch me work, filling my day with stories about this, that, or the other. The fence had finally been mended just as dark began to creep in, and I was rocking contentedly as we watched something on Grandpa's TV. Grandpa watched very little TV, but when he did, it was usually only one of 3 things. He watched the news 3 times a day, he watched Hadrian Meadows at 8 and 4 for the Fish and Game Report, and he liked to watch Spook Central. Spook Central was a show about some local paranormal investigators who liked to go around and inspect local haunts in the area. They went to many historic and infamous locations, and generally stirred up the things that went bump in the night around there. It came on most nights on Channel 12, in new episodes or in reruns, and Grandpa loved it. We watched Spook Central the way most people watch sitcoms. He was always so amused at the crew's antics, and he was always chuckling at something that they were saying or doing. Tonight's episode, though, they were talking about banishing a demon from the ruins of an old church, and I heard Grandpa scoff as they talked about the means of cleansing. "Bunch of hacks," he said, shaking his head. I glanced over at him, raising an eyebrow at the comment. "So aside from devil cats, forest lights, and cursed insects, you're also an expert on exorcism, I guess." "Of course," he said confidently. "I went with my grandma to several houses while she was helping people out. I watched her get rid of all kinds of haints and spirits and bedeviled people, but I only watched her fail once." He paused for dramatic effect before adding, "Luckily, the snake-handling man came along." I looked at him oddly. "The what?" "The snake-handling man. 'Smatter, boy? Didn't your daddy ever take you to see a snake handler?" "I mean, I saw a man handling snakes at the zoo once, but it sounds like you're talking about one of the religious ones." "Exactly, except this fellow was the real deal," Grandpa said, getting a little excited. I muted the TV, settling in for another Grandpa story. "Sounds better than anything on TV." I turned the rocker to look at him. Grandpa chuckled. "That's 'cause unlike that claptrap on the TV, this story is true."
When I was about 11, shortly after the cricket incident, Grandma took me under her wing and decided it was time that I was given a proper education on the ways of the woods. She had me over to her house most every afternoon so I could learn herbcraft and woodcraft. She taught me about healing with poultices and salves, about repelling things that might want to get into the house with symbols and little constructed things that hold intention. She also taught me more about the creatures of the forest and the old things that lurk in the deeper parts. Grandma was a wealth of information. I wish I had been more thankful for the time that I had with her. I had studied with her for about 6 months when I arrived one afternoon to find her putting some things into a bag. I had seen her do this many times before, but the longer I watched her, the more I realized that this was different. She had gone to people's houses before to cleanse a presence or dispel a haint, but I had always watched her select her ingredients with care and decisiveness. Today, her hands shook as she selected herbs in bundles, and as one of the bottles slid from her shaking hand, I felt my blood run cold. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my grandmother afraid of something. Despite my better judgment, I'm taking you with me tonight. Not for any lacking in yourself. You're a fine boy, but this place we're going is bad. Bad? I asked, unsure what she meant. How do you mean? She gave me an extremely hard look, as though she were weighing the idea of telling me things I might not be prepared to hear. You know about haints. You've seen the lights. You've seen the darkness that can find you when you least expect it. What we're going after tonight might be worse. Sometimes there are things that can get into a house and make it bad. Bad as it can be. These things can make people bad, too. But you've put these things out before, I stuttered, fear creeping into my voice. That's true, but this is different. This is the true evil, the old evil, the kind they talk about in church. I've faced it before, but this time feels different. This time, I'm not sure if I have the strength or the will to cast them out. She gathered her provisions, and I sat pondering the nature of our work that night. Then, as the afternoon sun began to dip just the tiniest bit, we set out for our work. We arrived as the sun hit the midpoint of its set, and I immediately wished I had never left my grandmother's house. Have you ever seen a place from your car, a perfectly normal place, and just felt like it was wrong? You couldn't tell why, and you couldn't say why, but the whole place just made your skin crawl. The shadows linger a little too thickly around the porch. The darkness nestles like bugs in the eaves, and the whole place just seems like a grinning mouth inviting you to come in. You drive past, and you shudder, but you aren't sure why, and it makes the place seem so scary. This house had an aura about it, and I could see Grandma getting nervous as well. The woman who answered the door was a friend of Grandma's. I'd seen her at the house before. I thought her name might be Ella or Ellen, but she had never looked so ragged as she did now. Her gray hair was a mess, all tangled and looking worry-worn. Her face was pitted with worry lines, and she seemed on the verge of tears. Whether they were tears of relief or tears of sorrow, I wasn't sure. "Thank God, Liza. Come in, come in. I didn't know who else to..." But then she noticed me, and her face clouded over. "Are you sure you want to bring him here? He's learning the trade, Els. The boy needs to see what it's like. He has to prepare for what he might face." The woman nodded and led us into her small home. It was little more than a one-story farmhouse set back against the rocks of the mountain. The place had a musty smell that made me think the roof probably leaked in the spring when the snow melts came off the hills, and it held a darkness that reminded me of a cave. The woman led us to her kitchen, casting frightened glances at the shadowy room that lay behind a tacked-up quilt. She made us tea and talked to us about what had been happening. Grandma smiled and nodded, the smoke from the tea ringing her face, but I barely listened. My eyes were only for what lay behind that simple quilt. It wasn't a noise, but it was like a low hum that seemed to warble across my senses. I had a friend, years and years later, a drinking buddy, that lived under one of those big power lines. I used to hate getting drunk over there, because I knew I wouldn't sleep a wink unless I blacked out. That hum, that soft quarreling of currents and watts, always reminded me of that sound I heard from behind that quilt. It was like tiny people discussing monumental things, like hateful men planning mischief quietly. "And so I called you," the woman said, and I found myself jerked back to the conversation, her voice jagging up on the edge of tears. "I'll do what I can, Ellie, but this sort of thing might be beyond me. I've never done battle with anything like what you're talking about, and I'm not sure that my talent will be enough to rid you of it. Have you contacted the Catholic parish over in J? This sounds like their ball of wax more than mine." "I wrote them when it started, when he came back from the quarry like this, but they never wrote me back. I've spoken to the Baptist preacher, the Pentecostal man, even the snake handler down the holler. You know the one with the revival tent that blew into town about a month ago. You're the only one who's come to help me." Grandma soaked all this in and gave a stoic nod. Then she finished her tea and asked to see Daryl. As Ellie walked us towards that quilt, I felt my stomach tighten. She slid it aside, the motion so much like a barker as he slid the cover off a freak show tent to reveal the most darkly hideous man I had ever seen at that time. Calling him fat would not have done him justice. Daryl, a man I realized later that I knew, looked like someone in the late stages of pregnancy who's preparing to birth a litter of 8 or more, maybe. He lay on the couch that sagged beneath him, and the smell of that small room, no doubt once a sitting room, was atrocious. Daryl clearly had just been letting it drop where it would, and the smell was a rank miasma. He lay on his back, his head lolling on his neck as his stomach pressed upwards like a hillock. His gorge was of writhing flesh, purple and veined, pulsating like an egg sac ready to burst. The room was shadowy, the windows covered with only the barest of light spilling through the openings into the sitting room. I didn't want to go in there, but when my grandma put a hand on my shoulder, I felt an assuredness roll through me and knew that everything would be okay. When we stepped into the room, the man let his head flop back on his neck and stared at us in that upside-down way that children often do. He began to burble wetly to himself as we approached, a soupy, marshy sound that pulsated like tar from a bubbling pit. When did he begin to... Grandma seemed to search for the words before flapping her hands at him. "Get like this," she finally said, words deserting her in the face of this mountainous man. "About a week, about 3 days before I called you. He came back from the quarry one night, like I told you, and just wasn't himself. The next 2 days he laid up. I thought he might have a flu, but then I woke up one morning and found him on the couch. He started swelling like this, and I called the doctor to check him out. After the doctor couldn't find anything wrong with him, he suggested that I make him comfy and see if he overed it or not. That night I lay in bed and watched the shadows dance on the wall. I heard him laughing and gargling in the sitting room and saw this strange light coming from under the door. That's when I hung the quilt, and the next day I came to see you. Grandma looked like she wanted to say more, but when she looked down, she realized that the rotund man was staring straight at her. When his mouth slid open, his purple tongue lolling out, his rancid breath was nearly as bad as the words that spilled out around it. "Witch! Witch! Witch!" As he gravelled out his accusation, the scant light we had began to flicker. The walls began to spin a little, the shadows dancing as the oppressive darkness became more claustrophobic. The swollen cadaver began to rock as he cackled and accused, and I pressed myself against my grandma as the night bled into the couple's humble abode. "Ellie Mae, how could you let this witch into our house? You know what it says in the good book about suffering a witch to live." "I would assume that whatever you are, you likely have some understanding about what the Bible says about demons as well," my grandmother countered. The fleshy hillock laughed, and I could swear that hands seemed to be pressing against his body from the inside as I watched. "Do you imagine that you can cast me out? Do you imagine that your grasping power is a match for mine?" Grandma reached into her pocket and pulled out a bundle of sage as if in answer. That's how it all began. Grandma lit the sage and wafted the smoke as it danced and seemed to heliograph in the darkness. The smoke took on the forms of warding, swirling towards the dark shapes that surrounded the swollen hulk on the couch. As the smoke swirled, Grandma chanted in the old words she had yet to teach me, and never truly would, it turned out. She seemed to become smoke herself as she swayed amongst that darkness, and as her hands reached towards me, I would place atoms into them, poultices and charms, herbs and items of power, and it was as if my hands knew the things she needed before my brain truly did. She dabbed the man with concoctions, wafted smoke and charm over him, and I saw him shudder as she worked. He did not like her work, but it still seemed to be no more than an irritation upon his skin. As time passed, I began to feel as though the sun must rise. It had been hours after all, days since Grandma began, and I could see the sweat standing out on her. She was growing tired, her energy depleting, and that only seemed to encourage this hateful specter. He cackled and snapped his teeth at her, the bones coming together like rocks in a quarry, and I found myself growing cold as I watched him rebuff her attempts to cast him away. "Foolish old woman! Your incantations are no more than the banging of bones and the screeching of apes. I was old when your kind scratched upon the dirt, and you cannot face me and win, shaman." Grandma didn't let it show, but it appeared that she had come to the same conclusion. She began to retreat, the two of us backing towards the quilted egress point, but the shadows would not allow it. They closed in around that square of light, thick and claustrophobic, and I feared to let them touch me. It appeared that dueling to a draw would not be enough for whatever resided within Daryl. It wanted to win, and it knew that it had us on the ropes. Grandma looked down at me as she came to realize this as well, and apologized as she drew me close against her. Then the door banged open like a gunshot, and I heard the hard tack of boots on the sturdy boards as someone came towards the sitting room. The darkness parted for that one, and as he surveyed the scene, he smiled in the loony, sane way that men do when they've spent too much time away from other men. The way wood folks or desert dwellers sometimes smile when tried by some child of fluorescent lights and the steady pavement, who have never known true darkness as more than a dim movie screen. He wore a long coat, his chest bare, with shabby jeans that nearly covered his run-down cowboy boots. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, less like a cowboy's and more like a farmer's or a preacher maybe, and on his belt swung a writhing sack that hissed and rattled. The hair that poked from beneath that hat was white as midday clouds, and he looked like a scarecrow filled with barbed wire. I have no doubt that he was a little crazy, but he was the sanity we needed at that moment. He came striding into the room, untying the sack from his belt, and the creature's glee seemed forced to my ears. "Ah, another shaman to try his luck. Come to me, pretender. Come to me and know what it means to stand before Legion." The man's voice was at odds with his appearance, and his voice was rich and strident as it cut through the shadows in the house. "I am no pretender, and you are no Legion. You are a sad collection of lesser demons, fit only to scare children and vex those who are used to fighting less practical creatures. No offense, my dear." Grandmother seemed to take this declaration well from her stunned position near the door. When he reached inside the bag, the hollow rattle preceded the biggest timber rattler I had ever seen. The creature cowered a little as the face of the betrayer came out to greet him. "Here is your brother, Prince of Lies, Lord of Flies. Come now before the throne and feel his judgment." He held the rattler around the head, his thumb controlling the top as his fingers opened that killing mouth. The couch shook as the mountainous man mound tried to escape him, but as the strange man began to pray, really spinning the hellfire, I saw the snake begin to glow. Its head and body was suddenly wreathed in a glowing aura, and that aura began to draw darkness from Darrell. The murk seemed to come swimming from his open mouth, and as it entered the serpent, the preacher dropped it and watched it try to escape. Then, as swift as any snake, the snake handler brought the bottom of that big run-down boot on the snake's head and smashed it out of existence. The man-thing on the couch screamed in agony, its gelatinous body quaking like water in a pool, but the snake handler was far from done. He reached in again and drew out another snake, the black body of a moccasin coming free from the bag this time. It hissed and reared at him, but he had caught it just so, and its writhing stopped as the corona of light enveloped it. The feet of the couch squealed in protest as the demon tried to lunge away, but they had made their vessel too large, and escape seemed like a happy dream before those dripping fangs. His bag seemed limitless. The snake handler seemed to pull more varieties of serpent from that crocus sack than I had ever seen before. Some were venomous, some were plain old slitherers, but their fates were always the same. The floor was soon thick with clotted snake blood, and the man on the couch seemed to be shrieking with every otherworldly presence pulled from him. All at once, he was less of a mountain and more of a rotund boulder. Suddenly, he was merely portly, his flesh still stretched and bruised where the demons had taken up inside of him. He tried to flee once, his legs bucking under him, before the snake handler could catch his shoulders and push him against the couch. The snake he pulled from the bag was the biggest yet, a massive rattlesnake with glistening fangs, and the demon quaked before him, knowing his time had come. "You dare not! You dare not! You are nothing! I was old when your ancestors drew out of the primordial ooze. My ancestors stumbled naked from the garden, wretch, and you will return to the pits from whence you came," the snake-handling man screamed at him. The demon's screams cascaded around us as he was laboriously drawn from the man, and the snake actually turned to strike as he fell heavily to the floor. The boot came down nonetheless, and the snake handler seemed to sag as the man on the couch breathed like a long-distance runner passing the finish line. Somehow, it had escaped my notice that the shadows were receding as he worked, and we now stood in the dimly lit sitting room of Ellie and Daryl's house. Daryl wouldn't wake up for another 3 days, and when he did, he told my grandma about breaking through into an underground tunnel and falling into a pool of the coldest water he had ever felt. As he pulled himself out, shivering on the banks, he was assaulted by things he couldn't see, and he had known nothing until he came to on the couch. He didn't remember the snake handler, the demons, or anything of the like. Daryl lived until 1973, dying at the age of 93, and he always thanked God for his longevity. He should have really have thanked the snake-handling man, though, because otherwise the demons would have likely just ate him up. That night, though, with his work completed, the snake-handler bent down and scooped up the remains of his snakes into the crocus sack. He tipped his hat to Ellie, now hugging her husband and crying over him, and told her he was real sorry about the mess. He clomped out the door, stopping just long enough to look down at Grandma and me and pass a word with us. "You gave it your best, child of the White, but there was just too many there for one person. You did your best. Know that God sees your efforts." Then he left, never to be seen again in these parts. I had stopped rocking at some point in the story, and was now simply sitting gape-mouthed and staring at Grandpa. "Quite a tale, isn't it?" Grandpa asked, his old chair creaking a little as the two of us sat in the aftermath. "So, you know a little about the backwoods ways? Like your grandmother knew?" I started, trying to figure out what I wanted to say. "Some," he admitted. "Grandma died before she could properly finish my training, but there's a whole different story, and I'll need to prepare before I tell it to you." Could you teach me?" I asked, fully aware by now that there were things in this world, in this very forest, that I didn't understand and did not want to run afoul of. Grandpa smiled. "Son, I'd be delighted."
The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. The fire crackled as we sat in the front yard, the crickets tuning up and the little stream lapping at its banks. The snow melt had been thick that year. The small cold snap that we had experienced the first week of June hadn't hurt it either. I'd been living with Grandpa for nearly a year now, 10 months to be exact, and he had been making these bonfires a near constant thing ever since the first snow melt in spring. They suited me just fine. I'd been cleaning up the spring limb falls since April, and the bonfire made a perfect excuse to get rid of the limbs. "Wait, you were just wandering in the woods and found a house?" I asked. Grandpa snorted. "You telling this story, or am I?" I raised a hand in placation and invited him to continue. Grandpa did not like being interrupted. "There was a little more to it than that. Wasn't you paying attention?" I looked away sheepishly. I had been kind of hypnotized by the sounds of nature, and had only been half listening to Grandpa's story. It was just so peaceful out here at night, with only the fire and the bubble of darkness around you. I liked Grandpa's stories almost as much as you all seem to, but I still get distracted every now and again. Grandpa settled himself again, giving me a look that clearly bemoaned the attention spans of the young, and began his story again.
I was young when this happened. It was after my friend had become a tree, but before Grandma had begun to teach me the ways of the woods. I had started taking to the woods more often, not having anyone to play with much, and sometimes I would camp all weekend in the Appalachian hills. My parents never worried about me. They knew that I knew the hills and hollers like the back of my hand. So when I kissed Mama goodbye one morning, my rucksack packed, she told me to be home by Saturday night so I wouldn't be late for church on Sunday. I told her I would and set out to camp in the woods for the next 2 nights. This was high summer, late June or early July, and it was about as hot as it ever got beneath the canopy of those trees. I was looking forward to finding my way to a spot I knew of near the creek. I could fish and swim and generally enjoy my time in the woods. When I got to the widow's house, though, I hunkered for a moment to make sure the coast was clear. Not because I was afraid of any widow, mind you. She was supposed to have been dead for a long time, but her house still remained, and you never know who you might find using it. This was just after the Depression, and sometimes vags and tramps would use the woods for long-term camping. I had heard of them robbing people, and worse, and did not want to blunder into a group of them who might be squatting in the widow's house. The widow's house was a bit of an anomaly in the area. Terry Manx, just called the widow by the time I'd come along, had lived out in the house till she was about 100 years old, they said. Her husband had gone to fight in the Civil War, leaving her and her son behind. He had never returned, and when her son had disappeared a few years later, the widow had been heartbroken. She lived alone in that house, but travelers said they often saw a candle burning in the window, as if to guide her son and her husband home again. It's said she lived in that house from 1830 until she died in 1910. The townspeople didn't discover she had passed until someone noticed that the candle was no longer being lit and went to check on her one fateful night. The man had knocked, and upon receiving no answer, he had gone inside to check on the poor widow. She had lived there for so long, remaining independent till the last, and it was said that he found her in her rocking chair as she sat before the remains of her last fire. The candle was frozen in her mummified hand, and neither decay nor corruption had touched her. She had simply dried up into a wrinkled corpse that had been buried in her chair, or so the legend says. As if taking its cue from its mistress, the house remained eternally. It had sat in that little clearing since her death, and no amount of snow on the roof or water in the valley seemed to change it. 30 years after her death, the roof remained on, the windows remained intact. The house sat like a monument, and it would likely remain to this day if it weren't for me. Now, I wasn't afraid of anything like that. Even so, you wouldn't catch me staying there after sun went down, tramps or no tramps. After a few minutes of watching the house to make sure it wasn't full of homeless folks, I went along and put the house out of sight and out of mind. I spent the next 2 days doing just what I had wanted to do. I fished in the streams and explored the woods and cooked my catch over a fire. Friday night saw a creature approach my fire that I would later call a moonchild. It had smelled my fish and came to have a look, but that's a story for another time. I don't want to muddy the waters too much, and this story is about the widow's house, and, more specifically, the widow's candle. So, Saturday morning dawned warm and clear, and I decided to spend the day on the bank as I fished for some dinner to bring home with me. As I lay on the bank, pole balanced against my stomach, I found myself warm and comfy and utterly at peace. I could hear the birds as they called through the trees, and I could hear the squirrels as they played and moved in the brush. I heard the gentle lap of the stream and the splash of the small fish that swam there. Before I quite knew what was happening, I had slipped off into a nap and awoke to find the sun riding low and my bait all but gone. I judged by the sun that it was about 7 o'clock, and I cursed myself for sleeping away most of the day. I packed up quickly, but I knew I'd never make it home before dark. The sun was sinking even as I packed my things into my rucksack and started making my way home with all haste. I could hear the night birds beginning to tune up, and I wanted to be well and out of the woods before it got too dark. Regardless of my want, though, it was full dark by the time I made it back to the widow's house. As I got close, I felt like I could see a light coming from it. The forest is black dark at night, moon or no moon, and the light coming through the trees was like a beacon in the night. I thought about taking a wider trail around it after seeing the light, being sure it would be the light of a hobo campfire, but I was only 10, and I don't know a 10-year-old who isn't possessed with a wellspring of curiosity. As I got closer, I put my pack down and crept towards the house like an Indian raider on the prowl. The closer I got to the house, the less sure I became that it was a campfire. The blistering fire became smaller and smaller until I came to the edge of the clearing and found the source of the light. It was a candle, a single candle left burning on the windowsill, just as the widow used to do when she was calling her menfolk home. I hunkered at the edge of the property line, looking for people who might be hiding and finding no one. This would be a great way to draw in the curious, after all, leaving a candle burning on the sill, just like it says in the stories, and waiting for people to approach. You could hide beside the porch or even in the barn, and once you had them good and interested, you could spring out and have them. It was a great plan, except I didn't see anyone around. The porch held no hunkered brutes or half-starved tramps, and the barn was of the pole variety, and no hiding place there. They would have to be poor fellows indeed to hide anywhere on the property, and that just left someone in the house. I should have turned around and left, but I wanted a story to tell my friends when I went back to school next. How exciting it would be to sit in the warm sun on the playground and tell them all how I had seen a candle burning in the window of the widow's house. How they would gasp and sigh when I told them about how I had gone to the window to see who had lit the candle, and I could already see them putting their hands to their mouths and looking shocked when I told them what I had seen inside that place of bones. My curiosity wasn't the only thing that lured me to that house. I've always been a sucker for a good story, especially when it's a story I can tell others. But I suspect you've guessed that already. So there I was, standing on the porch with that candle burning behind that ancient glass window, gazing in on the one-room farmhouse that I suspect had once been considered spacious. I expected to see people in there, maybe even people trying to hide, and I kept myself low to avoid being seen. Inside, though, was very little to hide behind. A kitchen table, a few chairs, a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a few bookshelves, and, to my horror, a rocking chair. A rocking chair with someone in it. The person was sitting in front of the fireplace, and I could see a dying fire smoldering in the grate. They were dressed in a long black dress, complete with a bonnet and everything, and a pair of knitting needles were moving slowly on their lap as they sat at work. The chair was going back and forth, and the whole scene was seeming pretty unreal. I backed away, trying to get back to my pack and get the hell out of there with my story. But that was when the door creaked open with a noise like a swollen hinge with a mouthful of rust. The voice that followed it sounded twice as creaky and just as spooky. Thomas, is that you? It's dark, son. Can you come and help your poor mother? I was frozen there, looking back at the door and at that raspy croaking that beckoned me inside. You likely won't believe me. None of my school friends did when I told them, but I was torn as I stood there with my fear crawling like bugs up my spine. On the one hand, the whole situation was just so weird, and all I wanted was to show my heels all the way home. On the other, this woman sounded old, possibly even infirm, and my mother had always taught me to help people in need. It was the Christian thing to do, after all, and as the creaky old voice asked if I was there, I took my first shaky steps onto the porch and walked into the widow's house. The inside was Spartan, but it was warm and dry for a house that had been empty for 30 years. I could now see why the vagrants liked it so much, and I imagined I could smell pastries and fresh bread as I crossed the threshold. The fire was warm too, and when the door didn't slam shut behind me to trap me inside, I felt that perhaps this was some old woman who had just gotten a little lost. Thomas, is that you? I've waited so long for you, boy. Why have you kept your mother waiting? I'm sorry, ma'am, but I'm not Thomas. I think you must be mistaken, I said to her, but she cut me off before I could say much more, swishing her hands at the candle on the windowsill. Bring that candle over here so I can have a look at you, Tommy. My eyes aren't what they used to be, and it's so dark in here. I thought that was odd. She was sitting right in front of the fire, after all, but I was too well-mannered to argue with her. I was becoming less and less afraid with every step I took, and when I picked the candle up, I saw the flame waft a little bit before it snuffed out. She tutted then, though how she could see that the flame had gone out was beyond me, but her words were good-natured as she called me to light it again. Silly boy, you've gone and put out the flame. Come light it again so your old mother can have a look at you. I walked past her, her sewing needle still clicking as her old chair creaked away merrily. Bending low, I stuck the tip of the candle into the dying flames and saw it wink back to life. Then I turned, candle held out before me as I started to ask her if that was better. That's when I caught sight of her, and I came to realize why she thought it was so dark. The woman had no eyes. Her face looked like a burlap sack, like a scarecrow whose face has been drawn just a little too well, and as her toothless mouth grinned wetly at me, I saw the hollow pits where her eyes should be. It was the widow, sure as I'm sitting here, and when I dropped the candle onto her, she went up like a pyre. I stood in horror as she burned, her mouth open and spittily, as she laughed and laughed. Such a warm welcome for your old mother, such a warm welcome. And as she croaked out her cobwebby mirth, I ran for the door. I could feel the heat behind me as the dry boards of the widow's house caught fire, but I never stopped running. I didn't bother with my pack either. I just ran for home, the image of that eyeless old mummy carved permanently into my mind forever. When I got home, my mother was waiting for me, all her bluster at me being late, as I threw my arms around her. I never told her what had happened when she asked. At that moment, I was just happy to have the protective walls of her arms around me. I went back for my pack a few days later after school. It was exactly where I had left it, but I couldn't help notice the burnt-out husk of the widow's house. The house had burnt to the ground, nothing left but ashes and charred boards, and I never went near that spot again. The people in town thought it had been the vagrants, and I never tried to dissuade them of that idea. The children I told the story to never seemed to believe me, and I was always careful not to tell it to any adults. They might think it was an omission of guilt, and I didn't want anyone to think it was a fire I had set on purpose. The spot remains barren to this day. Nothing will grow there, and nature seems unwilling to come and retake the place. I've thought about going back there to pay my respects sometimes, but it's not a place I would ever want to return to. I think deep down I'm still afraid of seeing her there, toothless mouth laughing and sunken pits looking for her lost son. It's an image I'll carry forever. The crackling fire caught a pine knot then, and I was pulled from the story as I jumped. Is there anything in those woods that isn't horrifying? I asked, finishing my beer as I threw the bottle out into the woods. This was a habit I had picked up from Grandpa, and it seemed as natural as breathing now. Of course there is. You've seen some of it. But the world is full of dangers that, much like any animal, can be conquered if you know how. Your studies are coming along well. By the time you learn all I have to teach, I'm sure I won't feel so hesitant about dying. I patted his hand and said, hopefully we won't have to figure that out for a long time yet. He smiled, but I thought it looked a little sad.